The thumbs up. Thank you. Welcome to our special meeting of the Committee of the Whole, 07-20. It's a budget meeting for the 2021 levy budget. I'll call this meeting to order. Right now we have 4 councillors in the chamber, and Councillor Danch and Councillor Wells on live stream, as well as all our directors and certain city employees that are online. So at this time, I'll have Councillor Bagu and Councillor Desmarais move the agenda. Is there any questions with regards to the one item on the agenda? I wouldn't think so. All those in favor, please raise their hand. And that's carried. Any disclosures of interest this evening? None. We have one item for consideration, is the Corporate Services Department Financial Services Division Report 2020-168, subject to 2021 levy budget. We have Mr. Bowles here this evening, who will present this to us, and then we'll go to questions, and then we'll take direction from council after that. Mr. Bowles, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, for tonight and for this opportunity to present the 2021 consolidated operating budget. I think as we go through tonight, you may have some questions as we go through, so we may have a couple points where we'll stop and allow for those questions. My goal is to go through the budget on a section by section basis. We won't go too fast. We'll go at a speed that allows yourselves to ask questions as we go. So I'm going to set things up a little bit by going through a couple slides, and then we'll go into the budget book. So if we go to, I think, the third slide where it says budget forward looking, it's just a reminder, and I brought this forward when we did the capital budget, that budgets really are forward looking. They're really set up to allocate resources. We do have a mandate within the Municipal Act to prepare a balanced budget, although we know throughout the course of the year these numbers may be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but ultimately we have to bring it to a balance by the end of the year. The budget I present to you today is balanced. It represents a 1.98% increase, or $68 to the average house. If we move to the next slide, it's just a reminder of our budget schedule for 2021. So we are on track. I do apologize to council and those that are following our budget process. We did have a bit of a delay with respect to the budget. We moved it back 2 weeks. It did give staff a little extra time to adjust to a number of changes in the budget, and I think council has had an opportunity to see there has been some changes to the budget with respect to the accounting and the presentation. We do have another budget meeting scheduled for November 12th, if required. That is available, and I think tonight, if the budget is not passed, we would look to defer it, but I'll leave that to the clerk at the end of the meeting to explain to us. The next slide is just the budget recommendation. It's just to make sure that council understands what the ultimate recommendation of the budget is. And then the next slide, which is pretty straightforward. It takes us right into the budget document. But if I can go a little bit off script for council and actually skip this slide for a second and go to the 3 slides that talk about budget comparisons. I had mentioned to council that with the change of accounts, the budget comparisons have been pretty difficult for the city this year. And I think in the past you've asked for a more regular financial reporting, and one of the complexities with that has been the way that our chart of accounts has been designed. So we have undertaken that review, and in doing so we have tried to summarize at a consolidated level the budget comparisons and the changeover between the years. So I will highlight and go through these, if you don't mind, in some detail. So the budget last year would have had about $27.7 million for the total levy operating budget. The prior year grants that we are recording this year, and we approved that in the capital budget, are about $1.6 million. The property tax increase that this budget proposes is $1.4 million. Just remember that when we talk about the consolidated operating budget, that includes the operating dollars, and this is where you fund the capital budget. So where we already approved the capital budget and that 1% increase, we do have to reflect that 1% increase somewhere, and it's being reflected here as an addition, and that's what's in the property taxes there. An interesting thing is, just with the marina, we've taken a more conservative approach with respect to fuel, and you'll see it also on the expense side. We've reduced the revenue and the expense on both sides by $150,000, so they net out. Investment income is actually higher. You might have thought intuitively interest rates are down, but when we redid the reserve policy and we kind of rejigged our investment policy, we changed the way we budgeted for investments. Historically, we've been very conservative and actually budgeted for almost no investment income. So this year, we've actually just put it into the budget to record it and show it to council. The other, now it may look like a significant number at $201,000 for other items. I will identify, and we'll talk about the marina, and we'll talk about the building department as we go through the budget, but the majority of that 201 is really the building department, the marina, as well as Nickel Beach. And historically, those budgets, specifically Nickel Beach budget, has been significantly under budgeted with respect to the revenue that it's able to bring in. I've also, and we'll talk about this in the budget process, that COVID-19, we have budgeted a general or an aggregate reduction in revenue. Hopefully we don't recognize that, but we did develop a kind of a review internally to see what some of our risks are. The other risk that is existing, and I identify it in the budget report that we haven't necessarily called out on this sheet, is the marina. If the U.S. border doesn't open, the reality is a number of American tourists that normally come and enjoy the city and enjoy the marina most likely won't have that opportunity, and we may have some challenges hitting our revenue targets for the marina. We would look to reduce costs to try to do the offset. And then Canal Days, it's a big expenditure for the city. We've identified it here, and there's also an offsetting expense reduction. You'll see when we go through the budget, we're proposing a much condensed Canal Days, but we've also identified that should the COVID-19 pandemic alleviate itself some, and we can go full in with a full Canal Days, we would look for council's approval to also be able to ramp up Canal Days to a larger project if possible. So if we look at these like at a high level of some of the significant changes between the 2 years, it brings us to our $30.3 million in revenue for the operating budget. Just a reminder, this doesn't include water, wastewater, or the sewer budgets that we'll be considering at the end of the month and going into December. So on the next slide, we have personnel costs at a consolidated level. So you can see last year's number, and then you can roll into this year's numbers. So there was 2 new positions that the budget proposes. There's also an increase generally across the board. There's normally an inflationary increase as people move through the grids. There are some salary and gapping dollars that we've identified throughout the city going into next year, and we have budgeted those, as well as we think there's going to be some need for some additional one-time costs. And when we talk about the COVID expenses, we'll identify those. They're really for around bylaw and for enforcement to ensure that we have that going into our summer season. And then on the next slide, it really gets into budget comparisons of the operating costs, and there's a number of them here. I think the biggest one, that's the biggest jump that people will see right off the bat, is equipment, and I put it front and center for you all. Historically, equipment has been something that we bought as capital assets, but in the last couple of years, we've rotated into an operating budget and some additional leases. So after a thorough review of all of these leases, we did find that the total figure is almost $500,000, plus there's some additional equipment that's being purchased across the city. We have included that budget here. Historically, some of that was included in the capital budget, and we also talked about the capital budget that we were going to move some costs from the capital into the operating budget, and that was included in that discussion. So that does make up some of the component, and then the rest of the component is really us saying that we have to put these leases on base. Staff has noted during the capital budget process that we will come back to the council with a 10-year plan with respect to our fleet. And we do anticipate that these costs will come down over time. But in the current time, they're built into the budget, and we're sitting at 1.98% with those built in. I mentioned marine fuel, and that's an offset cost with respect to revenue. The property tax and related expenses, this is also will be discussed as we go through the budget. This is a new expense that we put in here. We know we're going into a reassessment year. I think it's important for the general public to understand that when you go into a reassessment year, that doesn't mean that your taxes are going up. If your taxes go up the same as if your assessment goes up the same as everybody else in the city, there's no change to the actual amount of tax that you pay. In fact, when the assessments go up, the city doesn't even get any additional dollars. What really happens, and I think where it gets a little bit confusing, is if one individual's taxes goes up more than another individual's taxes, the pot shifts, and whoever had the taxes go up more than the other might pay a little bit more, and the other person that didn't go up as much, they might pay a little bit less. It's, I guess, what you would call a zero-sum game, that somebody that might have higher assessment growth will pay a little bit more during a reassessment year, and somebody that has a slower assessment growth will pay a little bit more. But ultimately, the city gets no dollars. So you might ask, well, why would we budget for property tax expenses going into this if we don't get more money? Well, what normally happens going into a reassessment year, which will be next year, is people start appealing their taxes, whether it be businesses or citizens. And this is just to prepare us to have a line to be able to refund that should MPAC award reductions in assessment. The next item is really insurance. I think the obvious question is, if it's going up 78%, what percentage is that? That's almost 15% we're budgeting for insurance. And the next logical question of council, I think, is, well, why aren't we RFPing it? I would recommend to council that we have the ability not to, and currently staff is negotiating the rate, and it may seem high. The reality is we're in the middle of a pandemic, and a number of other organizations have gone out to do their RFP process and are not necessarily experiencing a 15%. They're experiencing a much higher than 15%. So we will be recommending that we look at our insurance contracts following and coming out of the pandemic. The next items that we have in here are the Pastone, the hospice, and other grants, $66,000. I'll identify them more as we go through the budget process. Repair and maintenance, again, we talked about moving certain costs from the capital budget here. They are up significantly. A big difference here is we've now included some budget dollars for the Vale Health and Wellness Center and for our trails that we didn't have before to maintain the trails. We hope that this is going to provide a better user experience for citizens within the city. Training and development is a new one as well. You'll note in the budget book I talked about 2.5% across all the departments we budgeted. A general rule of thumb is somewhere between 1% and 5% to budget for training. This is a new initiative for the city, and I think it's very important for us moving forward to commit to our staff in order to commit to the customer service levels that we are looking to achieve. Travel is also up with respect to that. They kind of go hand in hand. The next logical question is, why are we budgeting for travel with that training component when a lot of training is going online? The reality is training likely won't be online in the same sense forever, and if we come out of the COVID requirements, we will need the dollars for travel. If we maintain in the COVID situation, we'll use those travel dollars that are mitigation dollars to offset any other revenue loss that we may achieve. And if we stay within the COVID component, the $50,000 I mentioned earlier for revenue with respect to COVID potential losses likely won't be enough to cover off all the arena losses that we may foresee. Again, if we stay in COVID-19 restrictions for the next year. Additional items, contract services changed a little bit with respect to cleaning and related. Subject matter experts, with respect to our new hires in that, we have tried to take a new approach to subject matter experts and reduce that budget. On an other net basis, there are a number of other expenses throughout the city that individually it might be $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 that add up to the 131, and we'll talk about expenses as we go through the budget. I mentioned the COVID-19. We are budgeting for some additional expenses with respect to COVID-19, including cleaning. We will talk about those as I get to the budget book, as well as Canal Days. I mentioned that we had the offsetting revenue reduction. We also have an offsetting expense reduction. But I would also like to highlight, as we go through the budget, you'll see that we still budget the same or approximately the same amount on the net levy for Canal Days at $125,000. So I know that was a lot of information to go through 3 slides, so some of the big changes between the 3 years, but I was hoping that that would give us at least a good understanding as we jump into the budget. To that, I guess I look to the mayor if he wants to open up for any questions.
Perfect, thanks, Brian. I'll start online. Do any of the councilors online have any questions at this time? I don't see Councilor Dennis. Councilor Wells, do you have any questions? No? Okay. In the chambers, any questions at this time? Councilor Bruno?
Thank you, Worship. Just to Brian, you spent a lot of time on leases. When I've talked to staff, some of these leases are sort of lease to buy. They're just paying a lease for 2 years and then it's ours. And so could you just drill down a little deeper on this, whether they're a capital purchase equipment or when it's a lease and it evolves into that buy? Like, how are you treating it? Are you still treating it as an operational, like in the operational budget or in the capital? And if you could explain why.
Yes. So the reality is that we do have a couple of these that are, I think, the smaller dollar equipment that we do have the right to purchase at the end for kind of what you would call a bargain purchase price at the end of it. We have treated them as operating leases because ultimately we may decide to maintain it or not maintain it. We also, in the operating budget our debt payments. So even though debt pays for capital, we're budgeting for that. We also budget for other leases within the operating budget. So we have included all leases, whether we may end up having the right to buy it at the end or not, in the operating budget.
Thank you. And then the second one, you mentioned about the tax expense. I guess the concern I have is when something's added for a special event, like the reassessment going forward, and then the reassessment's over and the people that have appealed and the lag in that, then you're into year 2 and 3. Is that then expected to drop off, or does it become a line item number that, for lack of a better word, maybe being a skeptic, that it's just tax room that's built in that isn't going to have a corresponding expense to it because effectively that expense was in year 1 and 2?
Right?
So I think it's a good, it's a very fair question because having been around municipal and public sector budgeting for some time, that can happen. What you will find as we move to the chart of account, we'll be doing triennial reporting back to council. You'll see the budget to actuals with greater clarity going forward, and that will provide you also the opportunity to say you'd like to reduce that expenditure. If when you reduce that expenditure, you also add another program at that point in time, that would be the decision of council. But ultimately, we would not be, as staff, recommending that you budget more for a line than you actually need for that line.
Counselor?
Just one last one. I realize this is a new format and a new base year that you're creating, but in next year and beyond, will this budget book also have a retrospective? Because as I've discussed with you, and I've heard councilors mention it tonight, it's hard without the base as to what it was last year to look through that. And I know that's another detailed document, but I do understand that you need a year to right-size things to get back to a base year. But is that the intent next year, that we will see the retrospective?
Right?
Yeah, through the mayor to the councilor, 100%. You will have, not only will you have it on a triennial basis, so you're going to get one in budget to actual in April, you're going to get one at the end of September, and then you'll get one for the end of December. So in next year's budget, we'll actually have the expenditures up to the end of September, and then we'll have the forecast to the end of the year. You'll be ready to go with that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. We have some issues with our IT, so we'll be back. Okay, so we're now returning to our regularly scheduled program. Just for those folks at home, we're now back after a technical issue. Just want to remind everybody that this meeting will be on YouTube as of Friday, November 6th, which is tomorrow. Staff will have that uploaded. Thank you, staff. Council, we ended with Councillor Bruno questions. Any other questions from members in here? And nothing online. Brian, continue.
Thank you. So at this point in time, if I can ask the clerks to help move us into the report itself, we'll walk through the report, and we'll have a couple moments where we'll stop and take some questions as we go through the report. So as the report's coming up, I'll start with a couple general comments, and it's on the first page of the report. really, I think it's important when you're developing a budget that the executive or the staff explain to council or the board, in this case council, specifically how we approach the budget. So we really approached it in a couple different ways. We really wanted to make sure that the organizational capacity of the city we had. We recognize that COVID-19 pandemic was ongoing. We also, I think, need to point out to council, and I think council is aware, and the public maybe too, we have had some changes in the Public Works division, and I think our interim director right now, Steve, has just done a phenomenal job working through this as he's spearheaded that department. Organizational financial flexibility is something, and taxpayer affordability is something that we always have front of mind. Also, we've tried to set up the pathway for self-sustaining entities to actually be self-sustaining. There is work to continue to be done in these areas, and we'll talk about that with respect to the allocations we're making for insurance and credit cards, etc. A desire to continuously improve, and we've included, and we'll talk about that in this report, where we've documented a number of steps that will be into 2021, as well as just the acknowledgement that this account structure really sets a kind of a new beginning or a new blueprint to track success going forward, to track our budget to actual, and hold us as staff accountable as we go through. So if we go to the next page of the report, I think I'll just highlight again that budgets are estimates, and we make a number of assessments as we go through. I highlight this report identifies the property tax impact at 1.98% or $68 to the average household. People have asked me, why do we use the average household not on water? It's because that's the comparative figure that's available to compare us to other municipalities within the Niagara region. The number that's calculated not on or including properties on water is not widely public, so we can't do an easy comparison between us and other jurisdictions within the region. If you might also be wondering, well, what is our number, like the total? It is about $206,000. So it's $10,000 more than what we show here when we talk about average assessment of a house that's not on water. So if we included all properties, the average assessment goes up $10,000. I also just want to point out, and this might be a little different than in previous years, we have budgeted for some assessment growth. We've been working with MPAC with respect to assessment growth, and we see that there is some positive assessment growth happening within the city. If the assessment growth is larger than 1%, which we do believe it will be at this point in time, the tax rate that I'm calculating, or the increase I'm calculating, would actually be a little bit less. Alternatively, come the final council meeting, when we right now schedule to approve this budget potentially, if we have a better number at that point in time, we're happy to bring it to council, and if council would wish to include that growth figure in the budget, they can. Alternatively, they can let that growth go back and reduce the tax rate. In the budget, we've also identified a summary, and I walked you through some of the changes in financial figures from year over year. I think some of the highlighting things that we'd like to highlight in this budget that it affords us to do. So at the bottom of page 2, we do highlight that Pastone was in here recently to council talking about the need to, and it goes on to page 3, the need to fund the mental health and activities across the city. You might be asking, well, why is there 40,000? Because didn't they ask for 20,000? Well, upon clarification, the 20,000 was an additional 20,000 for 2020, and then they needed 20,000 in 2021. So by putting the 40,000 in this budget, that would provide us the figures that they need to follow through with the commitment that they made. Hospice, residential, and community services was also identified at $30,000 a year for the next, I believe it was 3 years, if I remember correctly. So the $30,000 is included in this budget. As well, as staff was going through this, we recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing, and the community grants fund of $30,000 hasn't been increased in a number of years. We did recommend that council may want to consider increasing it by about 20%, which would equal $6,000. It has been pointed out to me that I think $6,000 was also unspent last year. That's a complete coincidence that those two numbers match, but it was a little confusing even to me once it was pointed out, and thank you, Councillor Bruno, for sending me that note on that. The reopening, I will talk to it a little bit later in the report with respect to those budgets. We have budgeted for increased personnel costs, which we have identified. We've also identified, or in this report, that instead of asking for additional FTEs, we have really taken a student-focused approach because we know our activities really ramp up in the summertime. We are this year budgeting for 48 student positions versus 39. We hope that this is a positive to the community and something accepted by council. It helps give students an opportunity to get work experience, and it helps us deal with some of our labor demands in high times. We've also gone to make self-sustaining entities self-sustaining. We will acknowledge that there are some stretch, or we have put forward the budgets that are going to need to be obtained. We've also put forward the fact that we will bring back the user fees for those. We had originally intended in our plan that we'd approve those user fees at this time, but because of a number of consulting reports that are going on, we'd recommend that the budget be approved. Staff will have to achieve those revenue targets, and we'll achieve those revenue targets by approving the user fees with council in early January. Or I guess early could be one of the 2 council meetings in January for clarity on that, to give that department time to do that. The next item is just many people have met and seen some of the new initiatives that we've done around communication. And I do apologize for those that have read the budget book. The term MARCOM means marketing and communication. When you read it, one of my acronyms that I've been called on a couple times to explain. We have budgeted for those 2 positions full-time. Staff put forward that we think that they're going to have significant improvements and support for the city going forward. And I think if there's questions going forward, the CAO, I think, has offered to help me with those. We have started funding future liabilities, which we said we would with respect to our reserve report, and that is included. I made mention to the property tax assessment growth. We have budgeted for that. We have established greater repair and maintenance budgets in the parks and rec divisions. When the reorganization happened a couple years ago, and we moved and we upped the service levels and expectations, and we moved it out of corporate services and created a parks and rec division really around that, we really didn't create repair and maintenance budgets to maintain our trails. And we've seen that, and we saw that many times throughout the course of the year where council had some issues. We have developed those, and I think the staff has spent a lot of good time on that. We've also established, as we said, instead of budgeting some really smaller dollar items every year in the capital budget, we've established some budgets for them to maintain the equipment at some of the facilities we have. So one of the highlighted areas this year is certainly the desire to install some new soccer nets that will help support some changing in the way soccer plays within the city for the city leagues. And I've identified the user fees that we'll be bringing back those in the beginning of January, but I also highlight that given COVID-19, outside of self-sustaining entities, we really don't look forward, or we really don't propose increasing user fees across the city at this point in time. The budget process, I also want to highlight, I guess, as the last kind of big change, and I left it here because we could have some time to talk about it. It would be a natural break after this to ask questions, is we know how the visitor center is currently working, and with COVID-19, it's basically been shut down. And there's been a huge desire to really improve our digital footprint around tourism within the city. People today make their decisions of where they're going to visit, when they're going to visit, often on their cell phones, often at kind of non like prescriptive times. And the recommendation that staff has is we can repurpose the temporary staffing that we used to have with students and the like there, and hire actually a full-time tourism coordinator. They could help us take the Niagara South Coast tourism to the next level. They could help us move into the digital age with respect to digital tourism for our companies that are located within the city and for our city assets, and hopefully help bring a greater tourism presence for the city of Port Colborne. So we do put that forward. The other item that I just point out is with respect to Niagara South Coast, we haven't budgeted for this yet, but we are working with our partner municipalities with respect to some cost share, so that way they would actually fund some dollars back. So when those agreements are done, those can come in and we'll report that to council. We are hopeful that we can reach some terms to do that cost share, in which case this total project would ultimately come down in cost over time. So maybe this would be a logical point to ask for any questions on those items.
Great, thank you, Brian. So I'm going to go to our counselors online. Any questions from any of the counselors online? Counselor Wells or Counselor Kalaliff? And Counselor Danch? I don't see, okay. And then I'll go to, in here, counselors to my right. Any questions at this time? Counselor Bodnar.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Brian. You touched on the fact that we're looking at increasing the student positions to 48 from 39. And can you confirm, either you or the CEO, this is a real need? It just isn't, I know it's nice to give students work experience in that, but you're also competing with the private sector for people to work. And I can tell you that in our industry, all of my friends I talk to, the people just aren't there to apply and work. So I want to be assured this is a real need, and if they want work experience, they can go work in the private sector because there are jobs available there. So whoever can answer that.
Gentleman, who wants to go first?
Through the mayor, I'll start and certainly give my boss, the CEO, a couple moments to help me out here on this. But we did do a full review, and you'll have a review, I think, a couple of pages later, where we noted some positions we didn't put into the budget.
Right.
It really came down to the fact that in lieu of putting some permanent positions into the budget, it was more economical, and knowing that we have peaks and valleys, to go for students specific. So there isn't a student in this budget that will not be worked, that will not have significant amount of work to do and not make a significant, every student will make a significant contribution to the city as they are needed.
Okay.
Yes.
Through your worship to Councillor Bodnar.
Just before you move forward.
Oh, sure.
So there is no public right now that can hear us.
No. Right now on YouTube, they cannot see it's buffering. That being said, WeeStream is recording this whole thing, and it will be posted tomorrow morning.
So just so council knows that we are offline due to technical difficulties. We will continue. Again, it is being recorded, so it'll be played starting tomorrow. There is a message on the YouTube face that says that we have technical difficulties. So I think what we'll do is have Alex send out something tomorrow too on social media with regards to this. And that we can direct all questions to Mr. Bull's office from the public. No, that they can contact the mayor, council, or the treasury department. So, okay, just so everybody knows. Councillor Wells?
I don't know if everybody's having the same problems, but my audio is going in and out, and I am missing some of the conversations that are happening.
So on the Zoom side, you're having issues? Harry?
For example, I could, some of the Brian's comments, I couldn't hear them at all. They were sort of going digital.
So that's a Zoom issue. That's not a we issue.
That's right.
I need like a 2-minute break again to fix that.
Okay, we're just.
Switch the internet, yeah.
My only concern, Mayor, is that in the past, there have been some segments of the videos that have not made it to the public. And my concern is that if our audio is being choppy or is not being heard in totality, then we may have some concerns being raised by some of the people trying to watch.
No, and that's a good point. So we're just going to break for 2 minutes. We're having our staff and the WeeStream guy just look at this and make sure we can try to fix that. So we'll take a quick break again. Okay, so for those on the Zoom side of things, we'll continue. Our WeeStream team here has no issues with this going tomorrow, that everything is clear for him. So the issue that Harry's having is a Zoom issue, not a WeeStream issue, so the recording for YouTube should be fine. He assured me it'd be 100% fine, so I'll hold him to that, Harry. Okay, so questions. We have, Councillor Bodnar had a question with regards to students. I'll go to the CAO.
Through your worship to Councillor Bodnar, it is a fact that we do use the students for a number of jobs, as you've described, as Brian has described. It's great. It helps with the seasonality of the city. It helps to bring in some helping hands when we have a vacation period for some of our year-round full-time employees, and it really fills in the blanks at seasonal facilities like the marina, like the beach and library, museum, and so on. And we do know from our experience, and I'm sure you've experienced it yourself in your time on council, that sometimes our students come back after school's over in their career and work at the municipality. So more than a few cases of students who have gained their experience in whatever their program of study is in university and then come back to the city as full-time permanent employees after the fact. So it is a very valuable service that the city receives from students.
Okay, Councillor Bodnar? You're fine? Yeah, Councillor Bruno?
Sorry, Councillor, but so I'd like to believe though that it was the pre-COVID number of students that we had that's just now being reinstated, because we did have a drop-off this last year. It was 39 what we were meant to have, and we had the drop-off because of COVID, because I thought that there was more students in 219 than 220, and so I don't know if you can clarify that.
CAO?
Sure, through your worship to Councillor Bruno, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we did have a hiring freeze during, we started a hiring freeze right away at the outset of COVID in the middle of March. That hiring freeze extended to all vacant positions, whether they became vacant through retirement or a person moving on to another municipality, and it extended to students. We did bring in some students for essential, what were really services that we needed the bodies to keep open, like the marina and the beach, a bylaw officer, and one or two others that escape me at the moment, but the number was between 25 and 30. It was almost half of what we typically bring in, a little bit higher than half.
Okay, Councillor? Any questions on this side? Nothing? Online, any questions? Councillor Wells? Councillor Wells, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. This is to Brian in regards to the last bullet. The question there is in regards to the visitor center and moving that to City Hall. I was just wondering if there was any justification for that, and if there was any consideration for the amount of visitors that would be traveling the mainstream, which is Highway 3, that would not want to venture downtown to City Hall.
Brian?
Through the mayor to the councillor, and I might, perhaps Ashley is on that could help with this as well. My understanding is we do about 10 visitors in the summertime per day. So I guess I would propose to council that like the 10 people that might stop by to pick up a brochure, would be able to be serviced at City Hall.
Okay, Councillor Wells?
It's not, through you to Brian, it's not regarding being serviced, it's regarding the convenience for the visitors. I don't know, if I was traveling through Port Colborne, I wouldn't venture down King Street, down Catherine Street, down to find some information out. That I would be looking for something that was more obvious, of which the visitor center right now is very obvious where it is.
Yep. CAO?
Through your worship to Councillor Wells, I do concede that there is a role for the handing out of brochures, for getting tourist information into folks' hands when they're in the city. I think what the treasurer is trying to point out is that there's sort of a value for money calculation that staff's trying to do based on the statistics of users at the visitor center. Our plan at the staff level is to still get those brochures into people's hands, that even in the era of social media, even in an era where we're trying to get our visitors at a higher point in the funnel along the path to purchase or the path to choose their travel destinations, there still is that face-to-face brochure in your hand contact. And I think what this budget points out is that we're going to try to find a different place to do that, whether that's a partnership with the BIAs, getting some brochures in different businesses, whether that's more digital reach or one of these other means of getting those folks the information we want to get them about experiences in Port Colborne, restaurants and retail stores in Port Colborne. We will do that. It's just a question of putting that building to use in a different way.
Councillor Walls?
Okay, it was just my concern. I was just wanted to know whether there was justification for doing that or whether it was a strategic type of plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there we are. Councillor Clayliff, any questions? Councillor Danch? Let's see. Councillor Bruno?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just off the back of that conversation on brochure distribution, am I sure the stats will point out some things of the last full year at the Visitor Center, as well as with the digital economy and people traveling and searching for those same things that were in paper brochures on their smartphones while they're driving. I was wondering, and the mayor's right in bringing up partnerships all the time, you know, one of the values of that visitor center on Main Street is that it's a provincial highway and takes a lot of traffic. The other intersection to me that could work and could provide a partnership is at 140 and Highway 3, perhaps with tourism directional to the Valet Center. I can't think of a better place for parking, washrooms, and if we could work with partnership with that help desk at the front there. I mean, what a great building to show off and to walk into and be able to sit down, washroom, there's refreshments there. And if people were cross-trained or one of our tourism students was there with some kind of working relationship that perhaps could fill a lot more hours in a partnership for when people want to come in. Because if that desk is open as much time as the Y is, I mean, I think there's something to be had there with our renegotiation in our agreement with the Y to use that desk and those racks. And you know, I think that even racks in there when it comes to literature is, you know, even looked at by some of our residents that don't necessarily get to see that and could pass it on. I think there's some good stories to tell there, just not for just tourists, but locals as well. So perhaps, you know, that is a way to fulfill that need for that place to pull over and for those that want to go in and actually get something physical in their hand. Just a thought.
Okay, yep, CAO?
Through your worship to Councillor Bruno, that is a fantastic idea. I know we have racks at the Health and Wellness Center already. We have racks in a few city facilities in addition to the visitor center, including the fire hall, where people can access in the unlocked component of the fire hall before you get to the locked door. So there are places that we can do that, but the human element of someone to speak to at the Health and Wellness Center and almost using it as a place where we can have a point of contact with a visitor or someone who's just passing through, who's looking for a meal, looking for a bike repair, looking for a place to stay. I think it's a great idea, and I'll work on that with staff.
Okay, Councillor Clayliff?
Just to add to that piece too, I know when we travel, it's always wonderful when you stop at a restaurant to eat, and I'm sure some of the restaurants here would love to have pamphlets about things available that to do in the town, and people are always picking them up when they're out eating. So maybe that's another thing with through the BIA or through the restaurants to ask them if they would be willing to have some card racks there with different things as well.
Great, thank you, Counselor. Counselor Demeray?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, and to add on to what Gary had said, we must be thinking along the same lines, because I was going to make that same suggestion. I don't think we can do without a visitor information presence on Main Street. I really don't think we can, because it is a main route through. But families to travel are always looking for comfort stops. That's what they want. They want that first and foremost, and we can certainly maybe do a little bit more in our parks, like Lockgate Park, that may allow for some, but Valley Center is ideal. Otherwise, we should be increasing our digital presence as far as, digital kiosks with various tourism pieces, and using, QR codes around it. There's lots of ways that we can do things to vamp up tourism, but the comfort spots are really, really important. Anybody traveling by car, especially families, you got to have them, and they've got to be on the main traveled routes. They're not going in restaurants for comfort. They're only going to stop there to eat, and usually, families don't stop a lot of times to eat, just a few times. So I would think that we need to have that presence.
Good, thank you, Counselor. Any further questions? Okay. All right, Brian?
If we were to move on to the next page, you'll see the summary of the budget, revenue, personnel, and operating expenses. And just to explain, thank you, Mayor. I have to press the mic button. I'll start again. With respect to this page, you'll see the revenue, the personnel, and operating expenses. And I wanted to take a moment, and we put into this report just to take that moment of reflection of what the total operating budget looks like before we get into the detail. A little different from in previous years, because the way this is developed is everything above the 2.8 million line is all external revenues. Like, there's no dollar transfers between reserves, there's no dollar transfers between departments in there. That's all the external activity that's happening within the city. And what has made our budget to actual comparisons and the chart of accounts complicated is, historically, and a lot of cities still do this, they record all the revenue and expenses and the reserve transfers and these one-time activities all in the same accounts, which makes year-to-year and comparisons a little more complicated. So we've kept all of the external costs up above that line, and then the internal transfers that we do to reserves in that below the line. So if you were to think of your city, you have about $2.8 million after you collect your revenues and spend and incur all of your expenditures. And then you're looking at, well, how do I pay for my capital budget out of that $2.8 million? So the 2.859 sits there, and if you look at the capital report, that is your capital budget, 2.859. Then there's obviously some transfers to and from reserves, and in schedule or appendix 11, we'll go through those when we get there with what some of those transfers are. Full disclosure is one of those transfers actually is we budgeted in the capital for some road preventative maintenance, and we said because it was such a large budget dollar figure, we wanted to put it front and center for council in the capital budget, because sometimes we talked a little bit about how do you know if a lease should be in the operating budget or the capital budget. A lot of that stuff that's being done in preventative maintenance, and because it's so significant at $480,000, a lot of that stuff has a capital component. So we do budget and capital. We recorded in the 5.8 million, but then in that $867,000 you see in that line, we actually bring it back into the operating budget. And you'll see that as we get to Appendix L. The bottom two amounts is really what's being funded from your rate budgets. So that's from your sewer, water, and wastewater. That's the amount that they're funding for capital fund with respect to debt and pay-as-you-go funds, which we talked about at the capital. And the 594 represents the amount of activity that people that are being funded on the levy are doing for rate activities. So for example, you have people in finance that do billings and customer service. You have people in public works that might have to dig some holes on the transportation side. This is the estimate of what all of those costs are. Now, having looked at last year's and this year's, that dollar differential is about $10,000 difference when we went through the whole process. But what staff has identified in this report is going into 2021, we're going to do a full review of how the allocation and the history of the allocation, because I think as council can appreciate, sometimes these allocations get set and sometimes they need to be reevaluated. And these things, this was set several years ago. We'd like to do, and staff will do a full report in 2021 and come back to council and show you the activities and maybe rethink how some of those allocations occur and let council give some direction on how to continue with that in the future. A high-level overview of so that is a high-level overview of the total revenue and expenses of the city. We'll get into the details as we get into the appendices. The next slide really, and I don't think council has had a slide like this in the past in their budget documents, and maybe you did and I just missed it when I was reading the past budget documents, but as a treasurer, and maybe because corporate services was brought together and we have the HR component as well to support the city with, we thought it important to identify the full-time equivalents and the headcount within each department. Because as you can see, a great percentage of the city's expenses are actually spent on people. So knowing how many people we have in different divisions is a mechanism to control the budget. Now, some might also be saying, well, what is an FTE? Well, an FTE is a full-time equivalent. So basically, we calculate an FTE by calculating how many hours they work versus what a standard workday is. So some people that are part-time might only come in at 0.3 of an FTE. Some people that are full-time will come in as a full 1 FTE. And that's why it's also important to show what the total headcount of the number of people are, because sometimes we lose sight of the fact that you have 177 people, so you only have to service 177 people when it comes to maybe an HR issue or an IT issue. But in fact, because we have a number of part-time people at the city and students, we have 240 individuals that will come to the city and earn a paycheck at some point in time in the year. And we've identified here again that the students are included in this number going forward. We also identify in this report that sometimes there are confidential matters with respect to HR that occur. We are going into a number of labor relations discussions with unions, et cetera. So we have scheduled, I think council already has a November 16th closed session meeting, and we'll be bringing some additional information and adding some labor relations updates for council on November 16th.
Any questions on that page? Seeing none online, any questions in here? Okay, go ahead, Ron.
So this next page, we really wanted to identify to council that we understand COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing. The reality is we put forward the budget that we believe we can continue to operate within the city guidance. The reality, though, is COVID-19 is ever evolving and things may change. Our revenue figures, specifically for the arena, and that may still be too high because we are budgeting really at last year's revenue for the arena. We've taken the approach the city remains open, if not in full where you can walk in, or we're either open full where you can walk in or we're open by appointment. So we're still offering all of the city services, but there is the potential that the COVID-19 continues to evolve and if it does worsen, our estimates here will change and we'll be in front of council to let you know. We have budgeted and we've recommended for these costs to be funded from the General Stabilization Reserve at this point in time. But by setting the budget will also let us know where we are with respect to them, where we can report them to you at trimester 1 and trimester 2. And if the province brings forward additional funding going forward, we already have a kind of a leg up to tracking where our costs are to be able to apply for that funding. As you are aware, the province gave us over $600,000 for our COVID-related expenses in the current year. We have gone through that process. We have told council that we would look at applying if we needed a phase 2. Financial services and the rest of corporate services looked at the costs with respect to the COVID pandemic. We are projecting a surplus for the city at this point in time, so we aren't eligible to apply for phase 2. I think the decisions that were made by the city at the outset were very prudent and found us in a position that the costs are maybe a little bit less than what we may have anticipated originally.
Any questions, especially those guys online? Seeing none, any questions in here? Good, thank you. Brian?
So I did highlight a little bit about the new budget document, just a couple of comments. In the old documents, you may have remembered things like distributed wages were all across the accounts and that. We will be moving towards an allocation model. As we go through the budget, you'll see we haven't allocated everything as of yet. Some allocations we're going to continue to work on, but by trimester 1, we'll have a full allocation of the costs. That doesn't mean the costs aren't in the budget. The costs are in the budget, and I'll show you where they are as we go through the budget. What it means is, and you'll see, we consolidated all of fleet and all of facilities into one account for the whole city, because everybody was kind of doing their own thing, and we wanted to see the total picture for the city. What we'll be doing, so the total costs are there, what we'll be doing going into next year is we're going to go through a cost allocation analysis, which is done at other municipalities. We don't have to rewrite the wheel or rewrite the rules for this. It's also done by the province with respect to the financial information return. We'll adopt those allocation models, and we'll allocate these costs across all of the departments, so you can get an idea of the full cost of each of the departments. And you might say, well, why couldn't you have done it already? It has a lot to do with the fact that there are some, as you know, in organizations, there are sometimes historical precedents why people do certain items. So there is a transition period we have to go through with our directors and with our staff to understand all those nuances, to make sure we don't just bulldoze into a new cost allocation model that may not appropriately reflect the true costs of those divisions. So right now, we've taken the approach that we didn't allocate the costs in the budget, but we will allocate the costs come trimester 1 reporting, and you'll see how that allocation works, and we'll follow guidelines that are already adopted by other municipalities and the province with the financial information return. I think a couple just other items in here is just to comment on the allocations. I think facilities and fleet is one of the main areas where we'll be allocating costs. And as we go through the budget, you'll see the two combined make up $3 million. So if the levy itself is $20 million, $3 million really is going to our fleet and facilities. And we've tried to highlight those with special new reporting this year. You'll also see as we go through the budget a line called self-sustaining entities, where we're allocating a 5% charge to self-sustaining entities. We did introduce that allocation, whereas I recognize I just said we really didn't introduce many allocations. We did introduce a 5% allocation as an overhead charge to our self-sustaining entities, and we did that simply because it recognizes the insurance cost and the credit card costs associated with running those entities. I think over time, as the self-sustaining entities under this new model where they have to actually cover their costs, get their footing, we'll continue to have a conversation if that's the appropriate overhead rate. Realistically, I think most people on council would recognize 5% is a pretty low overhead rate for anybody to have to pay, and we will be talking about if that can be increased. It really has a big indication of how we build these out over time. Day 1, with respect to really recognizing these as fully self-sustaining. And then I think, I guess on that page, I have page 8 of 10, and just double checking, I think you're on page 22 in the councillor books. We did identify to council, just so you're aware, items not included in the budget. A number of staff have put forward that certain positions would be helpful to continue the operations of the city. I do apologize because I know that there was additional, I think, support on a facility side that our interim director of public works had put forward, and it missed the report. So just to identify, there was potentially one more. Senior staff right now have taken a step back and said, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We do have certain functions of the city that have changed a little bit as we're moving forward. We also know that we are looking at the way we do things and our structure on how we do things. And we would put to council that as of right now, for that purpose and the purpose of just affordability on the tax, at a senior staff level, we'd like to take more time evaluating these before we fully bring them in front of council. That said, if council would like to put any of them forward, we can certainly, I can adjust the budgetary numbers and I can add them into the budget should council wish to do so. Is there any, I guess, I go to the mayor, is there any questions on that?
Thank you, Brian. Any questions on that portion? see any online. Counselor Bagu?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One thing in here, the Environmental Climate Coordinator, I know we have an existing one now, and that's under a federal grant, if I'm not mistaken, that completes it, I think, the end of February, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody can correct me on that.
Thank you.
CIO?
So, through your worship to Councillor Bagu, there is a position that's funded through a grant from a federal agency. I think it's actually an association, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I don't have the timing in front of me. I might, without putting him on the spot, our acting director of engineering.
Okay, Mr. Szapowski? Do you know the completion date of that contract?
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. It does expire in the spring of 2021, so that position would be eliminated at that time or not funded. So what we've done is actually request what our original request was for an environmental compliance coordinator and climate change coordinator. So those two would play hand in hand with the environmental compliance on a corporate level, and that's to basically take into consideration a new compliance regulations that will be coming online within the next couple of years, including our stormwater and wastewater regulations as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Szapowski. Councilor Bagu?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, because of that, like, I don't, with all due respect, I know the senior staff is looking at reviewing all this, but I think this position here is a very super important one to the city, not only for the environment, but also for climate change. And I really hate to have miss out on whether it's 6 months or till next year, but I think this position has to continue on no matter what. And I would like to see a budget for Mr. Mayor, if that's possible, because of the importance of this position. And I can wait to see what other councilors say.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Bruno?
Thank you, Your Worship. In the past, since we've been here, I know Mr. Louis had the opportunity to bring on staff that were needed, and they were mid-year positions, but usually they were accompanied by some changes or some savings. But what I don't want to see is that that we have to wait till this moment in time. And so maybe perhaps I could put forward some direction or get some response from our CAO. We've filled positions when others have left and we've rejigged the organization. And I take on board that the Director of Corporate Services are looking at some unfilled positions. There's always retirements or people leaving the corporation for one reason or the other. When I look at this list that's here, I think that for me, the ones that, I mean, I would first like to see if we can look at that staff review and retirements and fund the two positions I'm going to mention out of that review and some HR matters that I think are coming forward. For me, I look at when it's highlighted this way, as Mr. Bowles has done very well. We always knew that a lot of expenses in a municipality are going to be personnel, and they are. But it's easy to overlook that, you know, we're spending $12 million plus on operating expenses. And everybody's kind of doing their own thing. I find it amazing that to not have a purchasing coordinator when you're buying, you know, everything from pipe to wood to cleaning supplies to every single thing that a municipality does. You know, I'm almost thinking that, and probably only in the first year or two, that a purchasing coordinator might end up paying for themselves just with aggregation of certain expenses, a fair tendering policy. I think if you're a vendor out there to the city, you'd appreciate that. But drawing together everything and having somebody double check before it's purchased or investigating the purchase, to me, is money well spent. So I don't know what my colleagues feel, but at $12 million, I think the way it is now is got to be, some are probably done good, some are probably done bad. We're in, thankfully, only 2 buildings now for the main part, but I would really want to push forward that. The other one is, I think if you're a small community like this, and we've always prided ourselves on, punching above our weight class, is I don't think we can keep being nimble with one person looking after all the digital equipment, phones and everything else that's in Jamie, and the other one who was managing the organization. I mean, we're in a time where, that's another position that can not only protect us, but potentially make us do more with less. And so for me, those 2 positions, I'd like to see looked at somehow being funded in 2021 through either the retirements that are coming, the reorg, or HR issues that are being dealt with. So I don't know, through you to Mr. Louie, how that can be put forward. Do you need that general direction, or do you actually need the dollars allocated right now? Because I'm sure there are going to be some repurposed dollars.
CIO?
So through your worship to Councillor Bruno, and I think this will speak to Councillor Baguiou's request as well. The point is well made. I can say that we have a little bit different way of looking at our personnel here. If you'll recall, in the past, we've sort of done a little bit of moving funds that exist in the budget. That person retired 2 years ago, but we've never really stopped budgeting their wage, and we can use it for that other person in this other area and so on. There is no buffer in this budget. Like this budget looks at who we have on staff, the chart that you've seen here, how much their wages and benefits add up to, what were going to be the true expenses, and then putting it in the budget for each department. However, the council member is correct. There are the sort of, they're not budgeted buffers, but they're the actual buffers. When you get in and somebody retires in November instead of December 31st, or someone leaves us to join another municipality to further their career, and the replacement takes 8 or 10 weeks to find, and you save 2 months of wages. That does exist. We also have restructuring. When a position becomes vacant, we sometimes look at that position and say, do we want an apples to apples replacement, or do we want to take this opportunity to see if maybe that apple could be a grape and a strawberry in our organization for the same total wage, but covering some other tasks? And I think that's where we're at with at least one of those positions. I think that I can bring you a report because staff do identify the need for the purchasing specialist. The coordinator is the term we've used here. I think we can find in the first quarter of 2021 a purchasing coordinator through the restructure that you've identified. So we're not going into a full-scale restructure of the city, but we're always taking an opportunity to make sure that the structure suits the work that's being performed. So that will come before council. And so I guess I should say, at any time, you might have a staff report before you outside of the budget process that says position A is an important position to have at the city, and staff recommends that we recruit that position and that we fund it from funding source X. So I do intend to, staff have talked at the management level about bringing that request before council. Information technology analyst and environmental climate coordinator, I would suggest we don't have the funds and we don't have the restructure potential. So I really leave council with sort of 3 choices, and I'll probably get in trouble from the director of corporate services for this, but I think the easiest choice from the staff level is, do you lift that 1.98 to 2.1 or whatever the number is, and I apologize, I don't know that number, to make sure that the wages and benefits can be there in 2021. The second choice is a little bit more painful. The second choice is cut something else from the budget. And to be blunt, I guess, to speak truth to power, this is the budget we got, and staff got here by taking out everything that was less than necessary and bringing the necessary items to council. So at that point, it really becomes a political decision. Does council prefer to add those positions at the expense of some other program or service that's in the budget? And I think the third choice is the gambler's choice, and that's the budget is a series of estimates, and sometimes you don't spend all the dollars you expect to spend. So do you go into 2021? Do you direct staff to put in motion a plan to add to, it's a job description process, it's a recruitment process, and it takes a little while to get those employees in here. And do you make it up from the existing budget by making in-year belt tightening so that you have the savings in one account to fund these two positions? So I think the options are there. I would defer to our Director of Finance if he has some other buffer or pocket full of money that I'm not sure of, a drawer maybe?
Yeah, so before we move forward though, I think, unless any counselor wants a synopsis on the environmental climate coordinator, I think we've had a number of presentations by our current staff member that I think we know that position. But just for all of council, if we can get a quick synopsis of each of the information technology analyst, and in essence, what are they going to do? And the purchasing coordinator, and what would they be doing? Just so everybody knows what we're talking about.
So through your worship to council, both positions in my imagination would report directly to the Director of Corporate Services. And since he's the one with the podium, we can turn it over to him.
Okay, Mr. Bowles, if you want to give us a synopsis on these?
To council on this. So the information technology analyst, the reality is, and I think COVID-19 taught us, is we're going online in a really fast way. And there is hardware, and then there is the management, and there's everything about the software, and there's potentially, we had the report last council where we're going to the cloud, and we're bringing in new software items. The reality is the amount of work that's required with respect to maintaining and the updates and the functionality of the software is growing every day. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you didn't have to log online to do things. By next year, you're going to be able to go online and pay your property taxes like through a credit card if you wanted, right? These are all new technological advancements that we're moving into, and we need support to be able to continue to offer that service level. We haven't built over time the team, unfortunately, to actually help service all of those new needs. I don't know if I've explained it in enough detail, but at a very high level, it is going to be software management with respect to the number of new softwares we are moving to within the city. And I think the purchase coordinator really comes down to the fact that we have delegated authority across the organization for purchasing right now. And I would expect as we go through this budget in some of the line items in detail, I would anticipate council may ask me questions about credit card fees. Why are they that? And they may ask, well, why does it cost this to produce certain lease agreements, or why does it cost that to build certain items? The reality is because we have such, we have a delegated purchasing system, a centralized, credentialed purchasing agent would, I think, help the city achieve the best price for its future purchases.
Okay. Questions on that, on those two items? Just before you get into that, the information technology analyst, is that something we're going to need right away in the new year, or would that person basically come on board almost 6 months in based on the new software and computerization that we're going through now? Is that something that's going to be a January 1 position that's needed or could be needed? Or is that something we could actually add partway through the year so that for 2021 we would only fund that portion of their wages and benefits, and then in 2022 it's the full hit?
So our team, our IT team of 2, for the city that services 18,500 residents, would say they need it today. The reality is they would be happy if council wanted to add that in here at any point in time, and if it was feasible from a budgetary perspective to bring that on halfway through because council felt the budgetary impact was more palatable to bring it in at a stage, they would be elated on that perspective. What's important to know, and we, I think as staff, have to do a better job of communicating the workload of some of our staff. Our IT department, well, we have had IT issues today, and maybe it doesn't reflect perfectly, but maybe it does reflect to the point that we need support in that area. The overtime that is accrued, although not paid because they're non-union, is really significant. And I think if you have ever had an issue with your IT as council, they've always made themselves available. And both our two IT employees will find themselves here weekends and evenings trying to keep the IT operating.
And the approximate dollar amount if we added it for a year?
So the issue is by the time you get somebody at the qualifications to run software at this level, and we all know the competitiveness of the environment with respect to hiring, specifically in IT, your net cost for one of these individuals is going to be close with benefits to $100,000.
Okay.
So you'd be looking at 0.25% increase to your tax rate for that position. So right now the budget as presented is 1.98%. It would increase it by 0.25% to 2.23%.
Okay, and then the purchasing coordinator, the CAO mentioned that that may be coming to us in the new year anyways, based on some reorg. So is that something that you would, and I know the council would want it on, but to make this clear, is that something that we can wait for because you believe, as well as what the CAO said, that that's coming to us anyways?
Yeah, so just to counsel on that, just to be clear, there is, and for staff watching, there is no planned reorg of like finance or anything like that, because sometimes that, you know, is complicated when, if you're watching this. The reality is there are, and I think was mentioned, there are opportunities where throughout the city there are retirements and people are leaving, and when we look at the staff planning down the road with some of our directors, we do see the opportunity that over time we can bring that position in. So I would agree with the CAO. I think there is going to be that opportunity.
Okay. All right, Councillor, so on that one position, it looks like they're planning on bringing it forward anyways. So is that one that we could hold off on?
Yes, I guess I wanted to ask the question, if I could, through you to Brian. So you mentioned the 0.25%. So you didn't mention on the purchasing coordinator what that would be. And if you could, what is 0.25% to the average tax bill?
Ryan?
Do I get a second to do a quick
Yes,
help?
sure. Yeah, go ahead.
It would represent approximately an $8 increase to the average tax bill.
Councillor?
You know, I needed to ask that question because I think the public needs to understand that, what that means. But both of those two positions, and I'm going to stand down on the environmental one. I mean, every one of them I'm sure is important, but both of these, you know, both of these positions are, they're not just the almost $100,000. They are both going to save us money as opposed to just cost us money. The only thing is you won't see it up front in the business plan of doing it. I mean, you might be able to see it going forward, but I would certainly like to go with one of these positions now, in that, as you pointed out, Mr. Mayor, the other one may be in the works with some other moves. It's not needed right away. So I would like to move forward with the purchasing coordinator is first in that list of two with that, unless were you saying the information technology one would take precedence, Mr.
Well, before that though, I'll bring that forward, but I will bring Councillor Bagues first because he put it on the floor first.
Okay,
I'll put your second, but you could keep continuing, because,
so I'd like to
we'll
move
go back
forward.
to that one, once I get all these together here, so.
I'd like to move forward with at least one of these positions right now, and I would choose purchasing coordinator at the time, given the $12 million that we're spending.
So just to clarify though, because if the purchasing coordinator is brought online in Q1 next year, you're looking at not using increased levy, that you're looking at using existing dollars that are in the budget.
Through your worship to Councillor Bruno and the rest of council, the sort of 1-2 punch is, if you're lifting by 0.25, is IT first and purchasing coordinator through retirements and other reconciliations.
Okay, just only because then it's not, there's no cost to this budget on that, okay? Is that fine?
That's fine.
Okay, that's why I want to clarify it. The councillors online, any questions to what the Councillor Bruno was talking about, or any clarifications? Seeing no hands, I had Councillor Bodnar.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You asked the question I was going to ask to Brian.
Oh, great
earlier.
minds think alike, Councillor.
Yes. So, I may have worded it slightly different, but anyways. So, are we just dealing with Councilor Bruno's request here, or are we
Well,
into the environmental?
Well, I'll bring those back. I'm going to be bringing those back.
Okay,
We'll vote on them separately.
right.
So if there's any questions to what the two councillors have said, or basically tabled,
When it
or if
comes
there's anything new, now's the time to do that.
Okay, well, I have a question on the environmental
Yep.
climate coordinator. Can we get Steve back on the line? Just because he alluded, I thought, to the fact that when we lose this person in the spring, that we still had a year before we're into any obligation by the government to have this person, unless I heard it wrong.
Okay,
So I wonder-
Mr. Shapowski?
Through your worship to Councillor Bonner, so the climate change coordinator position, it was previously completed through different internships and students that we had through colleges in the area. They administered the city's engineering conservation initiatives, and essentially what we have is, it is February 28th, that was already mentioned, that position expires. So what would happen basically going forward is that if the position's not there, we would be back to relying on students or interns to fulfill those obligations. And although it works to a somewhat of a degree, that full level of commitment's not really there. So they would be working on things such as like the greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan that council's put forward, the 2019 energy conservation and demand plan, all different aspects that we should be looking at from a corporate standpoint for climate change. So it is a position. It's not like we could wait till next year. It's something that we have to start planning for now. There are other obligations that are coming down the line as well. We have to start looking at excess soil regulations. We have to start looking at like I was mentioning before, our storm and sanitary sewer regulations that are coming up by the ministry very quickly. So positions are needed, and the sooner that we get these positions in, the better position the corporation will be in.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shapowski. Councillor Bodnar?
That's okay for now.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bowles, the environmental climate coordinator, the cost per year for that position would be?
Yeah, so to yourself, so we're talking about 0.21% on the levy, which would work out to about $7 a year to the average.
Total though, for total cost for that position?
The total cost with benefits, we'd estimate about $85,000.
And sorry, you said a 0.21?
0.21, so your 1.98 would increase by the 0.21, plus potentially that 0.25.
Okay. Before I put these on the floor, questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The .21, is that the 10 months for 2021 or 12 months? Because this position ends 2 months into the year.
Through the mayor to the councillor, thank you for that. That is the 12-month number, so let me do a quick calc, and I guess we'll take 10/12ths of that, and we'll put it, we'll
So,
put that in.
yeah, I was gonna mention that when I did have it on the floor, only because, but we do have to realize that if we're putting a position there, we should understand what it is for a year. We know we may only be paying 10, 8 months, depending on when that contract is up. Obviously, they've told us February 28th, so you've got 10 months of it. But in reality, it's pay me now or pay me later. If you throw it in the budget this year, you're only not gonna spend all of it, but you know, in 2022, it's gone to that person, so. Okay. Counselor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is not about these specific positions, but about the tourism coordinator. If we were to move the tourism activities over to the Valley Center rather than City Hall, and would we still be able to realize enough savings to have the tourism coordinator paid?
That is in the budget? That's currently in the budget, that
Well,
position?
yeah, that's what it looks like. I just wanted to make sure that any changes we made to the plan as it's laid out, would we still be able to cover it? It's an important position. We want to make sure it's not.
So, yeah, through your worship to Councillor Demery, I don't envision any change in, I don't think that these amendments would make any changes, and I don't think that the plan that we sort of described, which wasn't really a motion of council, but was sort of between Councillor Bruno and I, an understanding of how we would roll out in the new year, neither of those would impact the ability to retain and fund the position of tourism.
Okay, thank you. That's
Okay.
why I'm unsure.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that and I personally, I believe that once that person is brought on board to work with our senior staff to actually roll out what we were talking about earlier, whether it's valet or repurposing the Humberston Hall or the old lighthouse building in the Lockhay Park. I mean, there's all kinds of, I think if you let that person come in that has that expertise, they may throw some stuff at you and you go, wow, that's great, let's move forward with it. So I think that'll come, but yeah, that is in the budget, so. Yeah. So I'm going to bring these forward, Council. These two that were brought forward by Councillor Bagu and Councillor Bruno. I'm going to deal with the environmental climate coordinator at this time, although it will be a 10-month cost on the levy in 2021. It is a 0.21% increase on the levy on a yearly basis. I have Councillor Bagu moving that. Can I get a seconder for that? Councillor Desmarais. Discussions on just the environmental climate coordinator at this time. Does anybody have any questions? Anyone online? Okay, Councillor Bodner.
Just to highlight, is that the about a $6 increase on a household?
Yes.
$6 one?
It's 6 to 7, depending on if you round up or round down.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Further questions? Okay. I'm going to call the question. Councillor Clayliff, did you have a question? Oh, okay.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I just wondered, is there a possibility, I know that we had funding for this position this year. I think it's very important to have, and I think we need it. Is there a possibility of, if we fund it and have this person, is there any possibility of grant money or internship money or something coming through? Or is this program strictly over once this is done in February? Do we have an answer to that?
Mr. Shapowski?
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. Right now, so it does end in February 28th, and there is, just looking right now, we had a total FCM grant, and yeah, so it does expire, and then yeah, we wouldn't be going forward with a grant past that date. So it would be for the 10 months this year, and then 12 months, as was previously discussed, ongoing from there.
Yeah, so that program is finishing then. Okay. All right. Online, I don't see any more hands. I don't see any more hands. I'm gonna call the question. All those in favor, please raise their hand. Okay, that's carried. I now have the information technology analyst. Again, that's a 0.25% increase on the levy, which was $7, I believe, was that? Was a $7 charge. Questions on the information technology analyst? Any counselors have any questions? Any counselors online? Seeing none, I will call the question to add the information technology analyst. All is in favor? That's carried. Any further items on this portion of the budget? Okay, seeing none. Brian?
Sure, thank you. So if we continue on with the budget document, the next page talks about looking forward. I'll take it from my experience and working with our CAO, we thought it was a good practice to start telling council with how we're going to develop the budget and develop some of the planning of the city going forward with respect to how we're operating. So we wanted to highlight these items. We will be moving forward, obviously, and as previously communicated, with the city strategic plan and tactical plans. The organizational structure, we are going to have some discussions with the directors with respect to who's overseeing what within the directorships. We are going to be establishing, as I mentioned, some cost allocation models to do full cost accounting. We will be following the financial information returns that the province uses with respect to that. I've mentioned already tonight, we are going to take a look at the allocation models we currently have between levy and rates in 2021. Something that I don't know if council is 100% aware of, but our clerk took the initiative as part of the modernization grants, and I know it was previously communicated to council, but to do some work with a firm called KPMG on service delivery review. And that is coming, I believe, I'm also looking at the clerk at the same time, to council on Monday. So council is going to hear about a number of initiatives that a third party has said that the city might want to look at to continue trying to reduce costs going forward. I just point out to council, because councils often say, well, should you work those savings into the budget today? The reality is by the time an idea comes forward and then we work on it, we research it, we see how we'd formulate a plan, it takes time. So I would put to you that any ideas that we'll be discussing on Monday will most likely be hitting the 2022 or potentially mid-year in 2021 if we were to initiate them. We are moving forward with KPIs. The service delivery group has helped us identify some areas that we could move forward with KPIs, specifically on our FTE and headcounts compared to other cities. We were really hoping, and maybe it was a little over ambition to the new guy coming in, that we would have a lot more KPIs by this point in time, but 5 months in, we have presented some, and I think we still have a long way to go on those. Obviously, the infrastructure needs assessment is going to be imperative to helping us plan our future capital plan. And we are going to take another closer look at how all of our ditching, draining, and storm sewers work within the city. We've been asked several questions over a period of time, and we anticipate there'll be specific reporting coming back to council in the new year. I've already made mention to a multi-year fleet plan we have started to work on. And also to look at some of the things that we do in-house versus some of the things we use contract services for, as well as reviewing our purchasing bylaw, including the delegation process, although I certainly appreciate the notions and the commentary from council tonight with respect to continuing to move forward on that. We do have the marine study, and there is beach road studies that are ongoing, as well as, and I could list other studies going on with cruise ships and that. There's a number of things, I guess, to highlight. This budget may be the beginning or the structural foundation to getting a lot of work done in 2021, but council's, I think, plan and agenda for 2021, from my perspective, is looking quite busy. with respect to the number of things that will be discussed and considered going into 2021. So having said that, my next plan was to go through some of the appendices in some detail. I included a number of pop-ups in that with some additional commentary. We won't go through every single appendix in detail, but certainly I'll give the opportunity for any questions on every appendix, and we can ask them.
Before we start, is there any questions on what's been presented so far to staff? I don't see any hands online. I don't see any hands in here. Why don't we, before we get into the appendices, why don't we take a 5-minute recess? Sure. Comfort break, as Councillor Demery called it earlier, and we'll be right back. Okay, council will get back in, and staff will get back into this. So Brian, if you want to start off on the appendix section, which I believe is section 2 in our tabs here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. So Appendix A, I think first I should just take a moment and just talk about the appendix. I know council's had a chance to read them, and others that may be watching this may have had a chance to read them as well. We introduced the kind of holistic viewpoint. On the left-hand side, we've kept on all the appendices what the total city revenue, what the total city personnel, what the total city operating costs are on the left-hand side, as well as the percentage of the revenue, or the percentage of personnel costs, or the percentage of operating costs that each have. We did that so that way you could have a viewpoint to how big the city is versus how big each department is as you go through. As well as you can see on the grade lines that fall below, and you see the 89%, 0.4%, 1.4. What we've tried to highlight there is when you go across, what percentage each of the divisions that we've broken the city up into represent to total revenue. We thought it was a mechanism for you to actually have some sort of metric to see the magnitude of different expenditures and revenues within the city. I won't actually spend a lot of time on the consolidated, because when we go into the other appendices, we break out general government boards and committees, and we go into each of them in detail. So having given that high-level overview, I will move to the second appendix, Appendix B, which if you're following as council, that would be the second tab 3. So in Appendix B, we have general government, and this might be a new term for council, and we've identified it in one of my earlier documents to say we're moving forward with the budget. General government is the area that you kind of budget in a municipality, and you used to have this before, you just might not have called it general government, but you ultimately budget things that don't really belong to any one department. They're shared across the whole city. And here we've broken it up into the global revenues that we collect, the capital budget, where you actually see the grants, where you're getting the money to pay for the capital budget, because remember, this is the consolidated levy budget. It includes operating, and the operating ultimately determines what your levy is, and your levy is what you not only pay your operating dollars, but pay your capital dollars. So we've also created the column called capital borrowing costs, which shows how much money we borrow across the city. And then we've created global facilities, global fleet, and then global operations. And I've created a number of call-outs on this, that just to highlight a couple. You can see under grants, the majority of your grants come from the OMPF fund. That's a fund that really, because of the size of our city, the provincial government gives us additional dollars to operate. That number figure was reconfirmed. It was actually reconfirmed just as we went to print, a couple dollars higher. We haven't adjusted the budget because it's really not material to the overall budget, but it is been reconfirmed by the province, and I think we should thank the province for that. And then obviously we've already talked in great length about the capital, which is really the federal gas tax, the Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, and the prior year grants, which we have in that prior report. Other call-outs, you might be wondering, well, why under borrowing costs do we have $125,000? Well, it had a lot to do with the fact that we did issue some debt for the Vail Center, but that debt was actually being paid for because of some donations that we had for it. So that's just the offset dollars. So council's aware of that. You had that in prior budgets. You just might have been shown differently. We also highlight that, I didn't budget anything for the POA, for the Provincial Offences Act, which is a shared service with the province runs, and then they share the revenues with everybody. I didn't because you may not be aware, we haven't talked a lot about this because of the dollar figure, but because of COVID, the tickets and the costs and all that really produced a situation where the region had to claw back what they were giving us this year, and with the lack of, I think, visibility into next year, we just budgeted zero as well. Historically, we've gotten around $23,000, but given COVID and given how we're operating, we're not anticipating a revenue dollar. If we do get one, we'll certainly let council know, and it'll be a positive to the budget going forward. If we go to the next page, you'll see the personnel expenses. Now, in general government, we really don't have any people being paid for because they're not the individual departments. But we do identify, because of normal turnover, we do have gapping dollars identified and budgeted as a negative cost to those to salaries and wages. We do also have a plan with respect to that, to maybe remove that structurally going forward. And we have, as denoted, a special meeting of council on the 16th, which will talk about labor relations on that. A couple other highlights that I called out, and Appendix C, which will be the next appendix we look at, really highlights a lot of the global facility costs. We also have highlighted some of the fleet costs, and I made mention to it earlier, and I think one of the councilors have already also made mention to it, that our rental costs are up quite significantly, and both the acting director of Public Works and myself would agree that, and we put to council into already discussing, that we'll bring back a full multi-year plan with respect to fleet. These are, the dollars that are budgeted here for fleet are dollars that the city has already signed contracts and we are obligated to pay at this present time. On the next slide, with respect to this appendix, I highlight the reassessment dollars where we've budgeted for those. I think I highlighted about $150,000. Those have gone up in my plus minus figures. You can also identify where Appendix C, you can identify the repair and maintenance budgets and the utility budgets of the city of about $1.4 million. We've also identified here, when you look at some of the global operations, we did centralize all the legal costs. They used to be between all the departments, and different departments would manage those things. We've restructured the way we operate the legal expense account now. We will run everything through the CAO's office, and the expense account will be here. Not to say that there's any complexity or anything that we're worried about. It's more to a sense just to get the totality of it, to make sure we're getting maximum value for that advice. I think the next tab just really talks a little bit about the allocations that are going on between departments. You'll see, and this I think is an area where I would recommend that we'll have a conversation tonight, and over time we'll probably have some more continuing education with respect to how allocations work. But you can see the $822,000. That is really, when we get over the Public Works budget, you're going to see Public Works has salary to run facilities, and they have salaries to run fleet. Well, we budgeted it in Public Works budget because that's where the director is overseeing it, but we did bring the cost back on an allocated basis. We just moved them over here so you could see, and when you looked at the bottom, you could see what the true cost of the total, running the total facilities at the city are. And you can see the total facility cost is actually $2.1 million. After you get a recovery from some of your self-sustaining entities, being the marina, Nickel Beach, etc. And you can see the full cost of running the global fleet program is actually $1.3 million, including salaries. We've also, at the bottom of this, you can see the reserve dollars that we're transferring between accounts. We touched about those in the budget document itself. And on Appendix L, we identify some of those specific reserves, and we can go into more detail when we get to Appendix L. I know this last slide is a little complicated and new. Again, what we're really trying to do is not introduce new costs in this last slide. This last is really just trying to allocate costs across the city to show full cost accounting between certain departments. And we're going to continue to grow this as we start allocating fleet across and the global facility costs across the city. Maybe it's not the best page to stop on for questions because it's a kind of a complicated one, but I think maybe it's a good time to ask for questions. Certainly page 1, 2, and 3 may have some questions.
Great, thanks, Brian. Online counselors, any questions? Let's see, Councillor Danch asking anything, Councillor Buzz, Councillor. Okay, council in here. Brian?
Sure. So Appendix C, which is our tab 4 on the printouts for us, council here, I think this is a new look to what our facilities look like. It's probably for anybody that's reading our budget, it's probably a new look to see it in this perspective. And, as a staff person, I can highlight that there is some review that we're going to have to do in the current year. We budgeted based on the costs that we currently incur, but observations that come up to us that we are going to spend time on in 2021 is the City Hall hydro costs more than running the op center hydro. But the op center is running 24/7 sometimes with snowstorms and everything, whereas City Hall, except for on council nights, is normally not running late into the evening. So there are some questions about how can we do that. And then I think council, and with the approach that council took today with respect to climate and that coordinator, we can have these conversations, and these might be areas where we can actually try to find savings down the road, because in talking to other staff across the city, there may be an opportunity to, we've changed lighting in some other buildings, to potentially change lighting here or other items that could produce some savings down the road on the budget. So staff is aware that there are some, like anybody that reads this might say, wow, that's kind of surprising. Others might really read a surprising number is the Vale Health and Wellness Center. The hydro cost is $617,000 for that building. And I think it'll be interesting to see as we go into 2021, and staff is going to take it to see if there's anything that can be done on those. And that's our responsibility as staff, to be talking to council. It may be that we can't make improvements, but if we can, we certainly want to take another look at that. That is one of the largest expenditures of the whole city. And just from my own personal experience, where there are pools and rinks, this is an expected expense of running pools and rinks for a city. So I guess I would put to council, and I appreciate having our Director of Public Works on the line as well. If there are some questions with respect to these, we'd be happy to try to address those.
Okay, councilors, any councilors online with questions with regards to the first page on tab 4? I don't see any hands. Questions in here? Councilor Bruno?
Yes, I think it's a small item, but I guess the one that actually struck me as high was Roselawn, $4,200 for water. You look at other buildings like the library, museum, and all of those and what they use, and Roselawn's relatively empty. I mean, I look at it more from, is there any leakage? Because, I mean, that may be the first place to start with that building, or maybe it's dramatically dropped off, but it's a fairly quiet building, even most of last year. You had COVID, you didn't have
because of COVID.
Yeah, and yet you still have $4,200. That's
because normally you've got
something,
crowds going through with
yeah,
some washrooms, kitchen.
But actually, it's good that there was nobody, and if you have the bill that high, it's a place to ask some questions.
Brian?
Yeah, I put to council that staff met and reviewed the document, and looking at it in this line, this mechanism versus some of the other old financial models, it did raise a number of questions across staff, and this is going to be an area of focus for facilities going into 2021. And we're hopeful that maybe we have some positive experience and some good news down the road, but old buildings are complicated, and sometimes to achieve your savings, we may be also talking about capital budget items to achieve those as well going forward.
Councillor?
Through you to Brian. Mr. Bowles, this brings up an interesting question about, this was based on, is this based on a projection for what 220, in other words, this is a 220 budget. Is it based on 220 numbers? 220 isn't over as it pertains to these utilities. So did you get these numbers in, in September, and the rest was the forecast for October, November, December?
Through the mayor to the councilor, it's a really good question. We actually, for a lot of expenditures, used 2019 as our baseline year. We then looked at what activity we had when we were kind of back up to full steam. And then we looked at what projected rate increases were for different items such as utilities. So what we didn't actually just take, well, this is what 2020 was with a forecast, because we don't anticipate 2020 to be the future baseline year. If we do have savings, because we have to go into a lockdown situation or something into the new year, we would use those savings potentially from hydro to offset marina losses, should the government not come in with additional dollars. So just like we're budgeting in the marina and in Vail Health and Wellness, like with the Vail Health and Wellness Center, we're budgeting for revenue more on a business as usual. We're also budgeting for hydro on a business as usual. And for council's awareness, and you saw, I think, the report we did in the middle of the summer with COVID, that the savings when you shut down the arena and the pool on hydro is significant. It almost offsets the cost of, or the lost revenue that you get from not renting it out.
Okay. Online counselors, any questions? I don't see any. Okay, Brian, next.
So the next appendix is Appendix D, and we highlight, and we tried to group all of our boards and committees here. So we have the library, the museum, the archives. We do have Niagara South Coast Tourism Association, and there's a committee's budget that the city maintains. So the library and the museum budgets have been through their committees. They looked a little different when they went through their committees because they were ahead of the schedule for the budget. I really appreciate that. But the dollar figures between that budget and here, we've maintained them. So you get a picture of what the library brings in with respect to revenue, as well as the museum on the first page. On the second page, you get the personnel costs for the library, the museum, and the Heritage Archives, as well as you get the operating costs. And I did do a call-out page on this just for you to all understand the budgets for some of the committees. The committee budgets have kind of been all over the place historically, so we did allocate $1,000 for each of them, except for Committee of Adjustments and Property Standards and Appeals. We have $7,600. If because of the number of meetings and that changes, and I understand that some of the people, or there is a cost per meeting, which is very different for that committee than it is for the others. So based on the number of meetings and the volume, that may change those figures, and if it does, we do have a bit of a reserve for a number of these committees, because over time, where they haven't spent their money, we've always put it into a reserve that can help keep things a constant on the levy perspective. And if we go to the following page, it's a continuation of the cost. You'll notice, for example, that we don't have insurance costs budgeted across the, if we're on page 3 of 4, and just checking, you are on page 3 of 4. There's no insurance cost budgeted because it's a centralized cost. Down below, you will see us allocate a cost to the boards and committees of 5%, which kind of covers off an insurance and covers off to pay for their credit cards as well. Something else that is kind of new, we've introduced an allocation within departments. So sometimes departments are sharing resources. So we do an allocation instead of actually everybody going in and booking specific costs like to Heritage or Museum, because the museum is where we budget it. We then do an allocation below the line. And you might be wondering why don't you just take the costs and always record them in the actuals where they're happening? Well, one of the complexities with providing council right now with a budget to actual is because we budget on one line and then we record the expenses on a different line. So when you're trying to do a budget to actual and you don't record the actual expenses where you budgeted them, it's really hard to read the report, right? So what we've done now is we've said, okay, we'll budget them in one spot, and then we'll record the actuals in one spot, and then we'll do an allocation down below to kind of show the true cost of accounting. So I know I talk a lot about allocations, but it's really just about trying to get to true cost accounting, and it's trying to make the actual expenses easier to see up above. Like, what are you actually spending? And that's, I think, what you as council and the taxpayer really wants to know. What are you spending your dollars on? And then the final tab again of that Appendix D, 4 of 4, really just shows that 5% allocation, which is really to record the insurance and the credit card fees, which I believe I noted earlier, we centralized all the credit card fees centrally this year. And the goal there is really to incentivize divisions across the city to move to a credit card model, easier to pay, hopefully better for the customer service. We've also, well, we haven't introduced facility costs across all the groups. We did have, because the library and museum are standalone buildings, we did have a very good indication of what their costs for facilities are, so we were able to start the allocation process and allocate those costs. So at the bottom of this, you actually see what the true cost to the levy is for the library and for the museum components. I don't know if there's any questions?
Any questions? Counselor Bodnar?
Just because we were talking about credit card costs and that, do we go in with other municipalities or through FCM or something? Is there a credit card break for municipalities if they group together or something? Can you just enlighten me on that?
Mr. Bowles?
Yeah, through the mayor to the council, you have a good question. There is, if you get into a bigger bulk purchasing environment, we are going to go through credit cards and a number of other contracts going into the new year in 2021. I appreciate the warm welcome in the 5 months I've had to kind of bring up the budget cycle. The next phase of this will be to go through our contracts and either RFP them or go through a model to see if there's other larger RFPs that have already gone out that we can join into. I think credit cards is one that I'm hopeful that we can join into. My experience at a previous organization was that the credit card fees were lower than what we pay here. So I'm hoping that we can get into a contract, and I think your concept of FCM and that, I think that's the right direction. It's that a collaborative buy model. When you get multiple people in, you normally get a better price.
So just for clarification for the public's knowledge, the credit cards we're talking about aren't credit cards that we're using to spend money.
Right.
These are taking credit card payments and our cost to process those payments on our systems. So whether you're paying for ice or a fine at the library, I guess, or things like that. I know through business, we have the Canadian Federation of Independent Business where we get really good deals on our debit machines, which also take credit card payments. And we've farmed ours out over the number of years just to see if we can get a better deal. And that's an organization no different than the government side with FCM or AMO, where those numbers can't be beat. And my costs have come way down on what it costs my business to take debit payments and credit card payments. So just for clarification, these are costs that we incur for taking payments by credit card. Okay, Councilor Bruno?
Thank you, Worship. Through you to Mr. Bowles. I'm just, on this Appendix D, it talks about committees, and I guess in your blue box there, I didn't really see the Committee of Adjustment sort of fit into the regular scope of committees in that it's very much part of planning and the Planning Act and all those fees and expenses. And so I was just wondering, and maybe, I don't know if the clerk would know or Mr. Aquilina, but it just seemed odd to me that it wouldn't be under planning in that it receives severance and consent fees, and it just didn't seem to fit in the world of all our other committees.
Brian?
Maybe I give through the mayor. As a staff, we'd have no problem moving it. I think this was one area that historically it seemed like they were all budgeted in a consistent manner, and it being a committee, we put it under the committee's column from that perspective. But I think your point is well taken, that maybe it is a different kind of committee, and we could, for future reference, adjust where we actually allocate that. From my perspective, it's no issue. I might suggest that, for clarity, a lot of people may, when something has the term committee in it, it may just be easier just to leave it here and highlight it as a committee under the committee bucket, because if we then go put it within another department and Now there's all committees here except for one. And I kind of envision like 2 or 3 years down the road, council's gonna say, you know, committees, it says committee, so should we put it over here? So I think it's a preference of council, and if council would like it in the other spot, I'm fine.
Counselor?
I'd just like to maybe hear from planning on it, because it just strikes me that, you know, on the flip side, I don't actually see where the revenue number would end up being. So it just seems that you would normally have an entity that produces revenue. So if you're gonna have this, whatever this expense is for the contract services, that is part of that box, part of the box of 14.6, I just don't get what it would be.
So
So it just strikes me that, you know, it's a revenue producer, and I would think that the application fees are under planning. I'll bet you dollars to donuts it's under planning.
Yeah. Brian?
Yeah, so through the mayor to the councillor, I just, if that was the logic, I would just also point out that like, when we have the active transportation committee, or we have some of these other committees that actually do drive costs, we don't necessarily book that committee where those costs are being driven either. So if the goal is to necessarily record the governing body or the decision-making body to where every other cost is or where every other revenue is, we don't necessarily
I agree with that
do
part.
that from that perspective. By calling out and consolidating all your, you know, committees that actually would ultimately have some reporting or some responsibility for the city or into council in one location, it kind of negates having to find them, because if we started putting them where every expense was or every revenue is, we'd have them across the departments.
Sure.
An option.
Perhaps we could just get planning to weigh in on that at some point.
Mr. Aquilina, do you want to give us some insight with regards to Committee of Adjustment and how the costs of that committee are borne by planning fees?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councilor Bruno and all of council. The Committee of Adjustment fees are part of planning and development revenue. Part of the application fee I took into account, and that's attributed to the actual application fee that would cover the costs of the Committee of Adjustment members that are there at the hearing. So there's no cost above what is collected as part of the Committee of Adjustment application fees, whether it be through minor variance or consent.
So the revenues of the applications pay for that committee.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor.
So really, there's no levy dollars being used to pay for that committee. Correct?
So it should be.
That is correct, Mr. Mayor. It's all revenue, all made based on the revenues. There's no levy for that actual committee, for the committee membership.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Okay, Brian? Any further questions from any other councilors? I don't see anybody with their hand up online. Nothing else here on this part? Okay. Tab 7. Or, sorry, tab 6. I apologize. 6 was hiding.
So tab 6 is, I think, a spot where council may have certainly some questions. A number of council one-off or ongoing but very specific initiatives have been identified here, and this is where we've grouped all the programs, grants, and activities of council. There is actually, and you've, I think, gotten used to a little bit how this report works, that there actually was so many that we actually had to go down the list 4 pages, and then you had to start again and go down the list another 4 pages to get them all. To start it off, Canal Days is identified here, and you can see total revenues of $160,000. I think I spoke to at the beginning with my presentation that those revenues are down like $400,000 plus because of the agile, more smaller Canal Days that right now is being proposed for something to start thinking about and planning for next year. But that would really ultimately become, and our recommendation here is from council's perspective to, if you were to approve the budget, to say this makes sense to maybe start planning right now for a smaller Canal Days, but if things improve, you got the go-ahead as long as you don't spend more money than what we set aside on the levy to kind of grow it. So if you can bring in more revenue, you can also bring in, you can also incur some additional expenses to grow the event if it's warranted. This is something that the Committee for Canal Days and Parks and Rec will have to have ongoing conversation, I think, as the COVID-19 situation evolves. Ultimately, we didn't adjust really what the levy contribution was, although I will point out to council, if anybody's doing the review all the way down in the fine detail, for some reason, and I don't know why this was, we wrote 144,200 in that box, but you'll note when you actually look down that the levy cost is 125,000. So I do have a bit of a typo there. So that 144,200 should be 125,000 in my call-out box. The other item just to highlight is we do get some gas tax for transit, an important component, and while we're budgeting for the same gas tax that we've kind of expected, a risk obviously to the budget that council needs to know, and we don't know where the province is going to stay on this, is the gas tax has a big impact on, or is calculated based on the ridership. But with COVID-19, our ridership is almost non-existent presently. So, but all municipalities are facing this. So right now we've budgeted as if the province is going to allow us to continue to maintain that grant going into 2021. But there is a risk that that could change, and I'd have to come back in front of council and talk about it at that time. It's one of those nuances of being proactive and approving a budget before the end of the year, and then getting all the answers from all the funding agencies before the end of the year. So on the following page, I would just highlight the expenses we start to illustrate for Canal Days. I've included COVID-19 and some of those expenses, which we've already talked about in the full report of the budget. And if we follow on to the page 3 of 8 of that appendix, you get to the total cost, the revenue less expenses, the directly attributable amount for these accounts. I think, and perhaps something that I did go over pretty quickly in the early appendices is, again, the revenue less expenses directly attributable. That's all external revenues, all external expenses. This is, when you read these by a division perspective, there's always an employee of the city or a director that's responsible for each of these columns. And that is what they ultimately kind of have control of, all the expenses above it. They have direct control of. So if we keep continuing on, you'll see page 4 of 8 talks about some of the allocations. Ultimately, and the reserve transfers, you can see COVID-19 comes down to 0 at the bottom on page 4 of 8 because there's no cost to the levy. We're suggesting that money comes from the General Stabilization Reserve, which is meant for these situations where you have unexpected expenditures. And the hope is that these do become one-time. And the hope is that we continue to find provincial government support to maybe replenish that reserve, because that's how we'd fund that out of. If we continue on, page 5 of 8, a number of additional, not new, but additional initiatives that we're maintaining. You can see some of the costs, like the showboat is included, but the one I wanted to point out most is the physician recruitment budget is maintained. So there is a little bit of revenue we do have a source from, but I'd like to really highlight on page 6 and page 7 of this document that we are budgeting $106,000 for physician recruitment, for grants and sponsorships, and there's another $40,000 really for subject matter experts to help us through this process. This budget is the same as last year for physician recruitment. We've left it in the budget, and we know that staff will continue to have dialogue with council with respect to how those funds will be spent to support physician recruitment. And then in showing you physician recruitment, I kind of skipped over page 6 of 8 on this appendix, where I do highlight a number of the grants. Some of those I've already highlighted as new grants, and the rest remain as ongoing. This is what the city has been been granting in previous years as kind of grandfathered grants. I will point out, and some people may not be aware, but the recreational grants for Bethel and Shirkston really are going to those active community groups that are maintaining and running the building. That's also why you don't see some heat and hydro costs, because they're being paid out of that global grant budget. I'll just scroll to the end of this, and I don't know in this section if there's any questions with respect to these initiatives.
Councillor Bruno?
Thank you. Real quick, through you to Brian. Brian, just on 4 of 8, municipal election. So, it's paid for out of capital account?
So, through the mayor to yourself, Councillor, so I think it has a little bit of, you know, like how cropping and you're trying to get everything onto a page. So the full title is transfer to / from reserves / or it's a capital account. It's one of the two. So that $30,000, and it's a negative, so that $30,000 is actually going to a reserve. So we're ready for the next election. So there's enough money to pay for it. Now, having built the budget in full disclosure, as we plan out the future election costs, the election, we've been putting away X amount of dollars every year. We may find next year that number has to be a little bit bigger, just depending on, and we'll bring you back the full budget of what we think an election will be. But right now, we've just passed the 2-year mark, so as we get into the back part, we'll tell you. But initial projections say we may have to move that higher in the final going into the election. They are getting, got it. Good.
Okay. Questions online? Anyone online? Councillor Wells.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Brian, in regards to page 2 of 8, Appendix E, Canal Days. I was wondering why there are no salaries or wages put against Canal Days.
Through the mayor to the council, I think it's a very good question. When you actually go to page 4 of 8, you'll see allocations between departments. So what we did allocate is when you go into, you see 128,300. When we get to the Parks and Rec budget, you're going to see the events budget for people actually comes to 0 because we're allocating those costs to the different events we do, and we actually allocated almost half of those costs right now to Canal Days, but because I will say to council, because we're living in this world where we're introducing the allocation models, my experience is when you introduce these, there continues to be some tweaking for the first year kind of thing as you're bringing it in. So we may find at the end of the day when we finalize all the allocations across the city and the methodology, we may be at 45%, not 50, but right now as we're building the budget, we put 50% of the events budget here. We want to reflect to council that there is a significant city portion of time that goes to running the Canal Days. We have not tried to allocate the costs where other people across other divisions may also volunteer time to help run Canal Days, but that is something that we will look to get costing on built into the budget going forward. But this at least does reflect the events budget and the events people budget that's going into Canal Days.
Okay, Councillor? All set? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Harry. Next?
So if we go to Appendix F, I think number 7, we're at Council, the CAO, Marcom, which is Marketing and Communication, and the Economic Development Office. Is it appropriate during budgets to make jokes? But this group, there's no revenue really. You produce, all your revenue that you produce is in the global budget. Yes. Right? So, but in this area, so we'll move to page 2 of 4. You'll see the expenses of council, of the CAOs of Marcom and Economic Development. budgets, the full-time versus the part-time nature, and the employee future, or the employee benefits for each. And you can go down through, I think somebody asked me, I was asked by somebody that was reviewing the budget, what are contracted services under council? And that really has to do with the WeeStreaming and going on online like we have had to do. We have introduced a line that I think it was kind of buried before, and maybe it's just how we're trying to pull things out, but hospitality expenses are across all the divisions at a small scale, and the council number is there because a lot of the meals and activities of council is meeting with other individuals at City Hall, and there might be some items that are put out, or it's because meetings are going and starting at 5 and going till late into the evening, so it's for something. So that is really where those costs come from. On the next page, we have, you'll see, certainly now we're getting into the details where there's training and development costs are showing up, as well as the internet and telephone costs are in there as well. One of the items that we'll be introducing with staff this year is we'll be removing our internet access. We used to pay $10 for every basically iPad kind of thing. We'll talk to you as council if you still like that or not, but what we're recommending for staff at least is to pair their iPad if they need one to their phone, and that will save us $10 times 12 months for a number of people. So we are introducing a number of small cost initiatives along that way. We're also looking just on the iPads in general to eventually phase them out, because we now have a mechanism where we have one computer that we can roll people to that does all the things on an iPad and all the things on a computer. So instead of maintaining 2 devices, we can maintain 1 device. And the device works, it will actually save us time and save us money as replacing devices over time. So those are things you'll hear more about as we go forward. So ultimately, we haven't done the allocations because, again, this goes back to what I've said before. We're going to do the full allocations of how much facility cost gets allocated to each group going into the April reporting period. As it comes to the bottom, net funding position shows the impact to the levy of each of these groups. I don't know if there's any questions with respect to Appendix F.
Any questions on Appendix F? Okay. Tab 8.
Yeah, if we go to Appendix G, Corporate Services. So an item that I'll introduce, it's new, we have Corporate Services, which is a department, and then you're going to see Corporate Services Global. So Corporate Services Global, and you're going to see a Public Works Global, you're going to see a Parks and Recreation Global. What that is in each of our departments, we have shared costs that go across everybody. So instead of trying to say we're going to split everything up in the budget, like you get 20%, you get 30%, we put it into the global cost, so that way you can see the total figure we spend on these items. We also put the director, and if the director has an admin, we put that person into the global costs. And I'll show you in two more pages that we ultimately allocate those costs across all of the departments. So you'll see that, again, in corporate services, because we're not really the revenue generating group, we're not the group that's charging arena revenues or marina revenues. The revenues are not significant for the fees. But if you go to page 2 of 4, you'll see the personnel costs across the group. This is where the percentages, I think, become more meaningful. So corporate services is about 15% of your total city costs. And we'll go over that when we go to Public Works and we go to planning, we go to fire, et cetera. But we thought these percentages this is where it becomes very interesting, I think, for council to understand your total cost. If we go to page 3 of 4, you'll see at the bottom where it says allocations within departments, you'll see what we're talking about. The corporate service, the global costs, the shared costs come to about $260,000. And then we allocate that across clerks, customer service, financial, human resources, and information technology to try to get a better picture of the true cost. And we've identified, and a call out here, because many people may ask, well, why do you have a subject matter expert cost of $55,000 in finance, but a lot of other groups don't? That is where we pay the audit and the actuarial costs out of. I don't know if there's any questions with respect to the corporate service budget.
Any questions, council? See no hands. Guys in here? Nothing? Okay. Tab 9.
Appendix H is planning development and fire, so we apologize to planning, I don't know if we apologize to planning development or we apologize to fire, but we kind of put them all on one page because, as you can see, there was getting to be a lot of pages we're going through. So again, you can see the total cost of the planning department on the total levy, and the same with fire. So we start off with the revenue from each of the divisions. I will point out that building inspection, the building department really is, we've treated it as a self-sustaining entity. When we did the full budget, we found that they actually didn't come to zero. So we did push the revenue line item a bit. We will be back to you in January talking about how that impacts the fees on the cost side to it to make sure we get to self-sustaining going forward. The two items on revenue there is price and it's also volume of activity. What I've seen, at least on the assessment base, is that there is quite a bit of, the city is getting pretty busy, and there's a lot of activity that is going on in this city these days. On Appendix H, continuing on, you see the expenses of both planning and development and the fire department as a percentage, personnel costs as a percentage of the total city. And these costs that follow association costs, contracted costs are going to be pretty consistent across the departments as you go through. And you'll continue to see training and development exists for the divisions. I think what's also important to point out, you saw it in corporate services, I think you saw it in the CAO budget, you saw it in, you'll see it here, is each of the director does, well, we did shrink the subject matter expert costs. We did leave each director with a dollar figure that they can use based on, because council often asks for certain questions that you sometimes need a subject matter expert to help support and come out with an answer. We did leave each director with a budget that they can access to be able to get that information to support strong answers back to council. I guess I'd reach out in my question to council, I guess back to the mayor, if there's any questions with respect to Appendix H.
Appendix H, any questions? Those online, nothing. Anybody here? Nothing. Okay. Tab 10.
Appendix I is certainly Parks and Recreation. You'll see that here you have self-funded entities. So the marina, the cemetery, and Nickel Beach really drive quite a bit of revenue with respect to the city. About 6.4% of the total revenue budget actually lies in this division. I just highlight again, and I think I called it out before, that the marina is budgeted based on the marina opening as if it was 2019. And we've done that to show it as a self-sustaining entity. A couple things would happen if we don't achieve that. One would be we look to cut costs in other areas. Two, we look to utilize the reserves. And three, we look to any government funding programs to help make up the difference going forward. COVID-19, there's two entities in the city that have been most hardly hit on the revenue side, and I think council's aware, it is the marina and it's the arena on that side. On the next page, again, we show all of the employee costs and the percentage of the total payroll for the city, for the different components, as well as where we are spending dollars. Unique here is when you see the marina, there is a cost of goods sold component because there's also fuel and other items being sold as well. When we go to page 3 of 8 of Appendix I, you will continue to see the remaining costs of the arena. And again, you see for Parks and Rec, the global budget, which would include the director and managers that oversee multiple divisions, are budgeted in the Parks and Rec Global. And then you can see at the bottom of 3 of 8, we allocate the costs across all of the entities to try to give you a better picture of what it really costs to run each of those entities. And then page 4 of 8, we do talk about some of the allocations. And as I mentioned, we didn't do, again, maybe I'm a broken record on allocations, we didn't do allocations to all of the operating departments, but we did to the self-sustaining entities because we're trying to figure out what the true costs of running them are. So you can see the facility costs are being allocated to the marina here for the self-sustaining entities. The other item just to identify is when you're reading this, you're saying, well, for Sugarloaf Marina, well, we're pulling $13,177 from the reserve. Is it really self-sustaining? In fact, what's happening is we're pulling the capital requirement. We approved a $15,000 capital budget for them. They're pulling that capital budget out of reserves. Net, this budget shows them with about $1,800 profit. But again, the marina and the arena are the two that we're going to have to watch closely next year because of the COVID situation. And then the last page, or the next 4 pages talk about Nickel Beach, the parks, and the Vale Health and Wellness Center. And what I'd identify, I think, in Nickel Beach, if people are wondering, where does the revenue line come for that for $196,200? Well, an interesting point is in 2019, when the fees were less, we collected $153,000. And in 2020, when the fees were more and we closed the beach 2 weeks early, fees were $224,000. So when we came up with this number, the genesis right now, and there is working groups that have been started to make sure that we present to council a very strong beach program for next year. The genesis here right now is to plan for fewer cars, fewer people on the beach, and potentially a book in advance model so you can control the volumes going forward. And under that model, we booked about 110 to 120 cars on the weekends and somewhere between 50 and 60 on the weekdays. And if you do that with the fees that we charge this year, you would get to this figure. So we think this figure is very doable with even a reduced number of people on the beach with the program. So I'll leave that to the director of community to bring back and talk more detail and work with council on that. But that is the thinking right now. We're planning right now that council will be interested in reopening the beach under certain circumstances, crowd control, etc. We've budgeted it here.
Okay.
On page 6 of 8, a couple other, I guess, call-outs. Well, we did budget for the fleet centrally. The Parks Division has had, I think, continued effort with kind of building a fleet structure to support, because I think as council has asked a number of requirements to increase the level of service over a period of time. So as we were building the budget, we did notice kind of that we had $57,000 roughly in rental costs that were really fleet related here. So we just highlighted it. In the future, we will move it all into fleet, but we just wanted to highlight that included in that number are some fleet costs that we'll have to centralize afterwards. And we also wanted to highlight that, because when you see a big number like $382,000 for the Vale Health and Wellness Center, that about $300,000 of that is the YMCA contract. And I understand the genesis of the YMCA contract really goes down to that is, and I stand to be corrected, the cost or potentially less than the cost of running the old facility. So it was really, that's how that contract got developed. 7 of 8 just kind of brings us to the finale of what those budgets ultimately come to, and page 8 of 8 says your total levy impact. And again, we're budgeting for 0 impact from Nickel Beach on the levy. You can see the total impact for the trails and parks on the beach, on the levy, and the Vale Health and Wellness Center to the levy. I don't know if there's any questions on the Parks and Recreation pages.
What questions on Appendix I? Anyone online? Councilor Kaleo, if I don't see anything. Councilor Danch. We lose Councilor Wells? Oh, okay. We can always we'll come back. Councilor Bruno in here? Yep.
Thank you, Worship, through you to Mr. Bowles. Mr. Bowles, notwithstanding being moved back into the $15,000 reserve to Sugar Harbor Marina, as an SSE, well, why don't I start with at the beginning? So one of the things is you have a Marina Consultants report being finalized now, and fees for January 1st are going to be coming forward. So I need to ask you, what did you use for fees and rates for the marina for this budget? Are you expecting a new fee schedule coming forward that will amend this? Or for the marina, have you decided on the fees that you've plugged into the budget?
Brian?
Through the mayor to the councillor, we built the budget, we looked at the 2019 revenues, and then we looked at the increase, and then we looked at what an increase might be going into the new year based on early indication and understanding of how to bring this to a balanced SSE. And that's how we established the number. But as of right now, because of the report going on, we know that the makeup of those fees, so right now, let's say there's 100 fees. The makeup of those fees may come down to 20 or 30 fees. They'll look different going forward. I think what I'd say to council is the marina has to be balanced. We're putting forward that we want to run it as a self-sustaining entity. These are the dollar figures that are required to meet that balanced requirement. We may adjust the traditional nature to how we did the fees in the past. We'll look to the consultant and we'll bring that report back to you in January. We won't publicize the fees until we bring it back to you, and that fee list will total this 934.
Counselor?
I'm a little, notwithstanding COVID, and maybe that is the rub in this, but the verbiage that we want to bring this to a self-sustaining entity is not what I see the goal is. In other words, if the goal to me is to not make it a self-sustaining entity. The goal from my point of view is that it should generate additional cash. And I'm not saying that you're not saying that you don't want to aspire to that either. But I think when I'm more worried that, if COVID is the elephant in the room on this, and you're waiting for all this to come forward, is there going to be a business plan for the marina that says, this is our return on investment, this is the number we expect to be hit, as opposed to, let's try and make sure we at least break even. I just don't want that to be the philosophy. And so I guess I really want to know if COVID in your mind is the fly in the ointment of this, or is there going to be a business plan that guides council, or a staff report that comes back and says, based on other marinas, based on our costs, the number of slips we have, the marketing we're doing, this is this year's bottom line, and this is next year's bottom line, and this is what we're shooting for, so that there is a target, and the target needs to be more than breaking even, because breaking even is pretty dangerous, because that means everything goes according to plan, and the world, as we know, doesn't always work that way, and we all want money in the reserve. So I'm just wondering if you could, is the reason for the net being $1,000 and some odd dollars COVID?
Brian?
No, the net of $1,000 some odd dollars is not because of COVID. The net of that figure right now is simply, sorry, through the mayor to the councillor, is simply, it's a starting point. The marina has been at a position where it's been trying to move to self-sustaining, and we've now put it in a structure that we want to operate under, just like we talked about earlier, where we've introduced an overhead rate of 5% and we're going to grow it over a period of time. This is a starting point to get to. Ultimately, in order to hit that revenue target, their fees need to be 10% higher than 2019. So to create a starting point of a 10% jump going through, and while this is not, let's take COVID out of it, a 10% jump over 2 years on a municipal asset is a new way of thinking. It's a new way of doing business. And this is just coming to this figure right now because we need to be balanced, because we want to be balanced, because this is a self-sustaining entity and we want them to cover their costs. If when we go through the business plan and we finalize that, and the director may have additional comments on this, we find that the market will bear a fee of significantly higher, staff here will recommend to council that significantly higher rate. And ultimately, you will find a surplus. But if that report comes back and says we can't get the fee higher, I think we're just trying to be conservative, because we know that from a fee perspective, we can probably get the fees here at this point in time. Our aspiration is to achieve, I think, what council is telling us to do, go beyond break even. And in the years to come, we'll bring back and we'll work you beyond break even. But today, I think break even is the goal for year one. And that may not be the ultimate desire, and that may not be where you want to be today. I'm going to suggest to you that a break even in this year will give you a foundation to build a stronger plan going forward.
Counselor?
Thank you. You know, when I look at this in retrospect and the conversations that we've had, I mean, there have been at least some significant, not only the 5%, but the distribution of some senior management salaries into that. So, I do see that you are at least moving in that direction for full cost recovery rather than potentially making money because you don't have all the costs in. So I'm encouraged that this is a first step, and I'm fine for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any, yes, Councillor Bagan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. To Mr. Bowles, Nickel Beach, you mentioned the revenue of $224,000 in 2020. Will council receive the full financial report on Nickel Beach for 2020, or do we have to wait like a year from now and doing the next budget, or is it going to come a little bit sooner? And probably even the cost of Pleasant Beach Road, the police there and the police all over the place, and all the extra costs with contractors and security guards, and I think council should be informed on that, because if COVID still comes along, those numbers are important.
Mr. Bowles?
Yeah, through the mayor to the councillor, we can certainly produce a specific report for Nickel Beach, and it can potentially, for Nickel Beach, can go along with the ongoing work that team is doing to set up the plan for next year. With respect to total COVID costs for the city, I can prepare an independent report for council. My original intention was, and you're going to see a report on council on Monday that introduces actually the 2019 financial statements, which goes along with what you're saying. Do I have to wait a year for it? In there, we outline a timeline that will give you the 2020 financial statements and the surplus deficit of 2020 in the March period, instead of having to wait till November to get it. So my original intent was to give you that full accounting in March based on the year end. We're about 6-7 weeks, right, till the end of the year. We're going to lock down the year, and then we're going to work on a report with the full accounting at that point in time.
Counselor? Thank you. Council online, any questions? Do we have Councillor Wells back?
He was back in the chair.
He was in and now he's gone?
Yeah.
I thought I saw him flash up there. Councillor Bruno?
Councillor Demery.
Sorry, Councillor Demery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, a little bit off topic, but I would actually appreciate a report on the waterfront management piece as well, just to see what's happened in the last year has cost us. Just have some idea of where we're going with that, because we've got a plan for the future, and these waterfront issues are going to continue, I'm sure.
Okay.
That would be handy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor?
Thank you, Your Worship. This is a bit of an anomaly, but I know Mr. Bowles would give me figures on the year before COVID on Nickel Beach. But, this is a marker, and I mean, we haven't done the post-mortem here on what we want about the beach, but we are accepting revenue that was a result of COVID. And just so everybody knows, you know, COVID may, for Nickel Beach, have been a revenue injection for that entity because of the beaches that were closed elsewhere in the province. So I think just as long as we all come to terms with that number, otherwise it may be a deficit there. But that is always a balance between quality of life and the revenue on this. But I appreciate, Brian, the background information that you gave me today, that when all was said and done, the previous year, pre-COVID, actually had these kind of numbers, which I found amazing. Notwithstanding there would be less vehicles on the beach, I thought that the rate increases that we did, local versus out of town, more than juiced that revenue line. But apparently not, which is quite comforting in a way, that we could have our cake and eat it either way. The only issue I would say with a beach is it's more risky than being a farmer, because you can buy crop insurance, but you can't buy it for the revenue that this place generates. So I think it's one that needs some work on that post-mortem that maybe council can be made abreast of, so that it can make some decisions in advance of them having to implement them. Thank you.
Okay. We'll just take a break, see where Harry is.
He just called, so I have to hit the button to allow him to talk, and you won't be able to see him. He's on the phone.
Oh, okay. Ask him if he has any questions. I'm not sure how far into the Parks and Rec he got.
He's asking him to unmute himself. He can talk to him.
Oh,
Sorry, everybody. I for some reason I've lost contact with the world. I don't have any questions.
oh, okay. Just because we are on the appendix side, the Parks and Rec, I wasn't sure how much you caught of that. So then we'll have Brian move along if you don't have any questions on that one.
No, move along.
Okay. Thanks, Harry. Item or tab 11.
Yeah. So we now move into, for us here, tab 11, and for the public report, it's called Appendix J, Public Works. So again, in Public Works, we have the global account where all the director, admin, and shared costs are, and then we have the different groups. So there's project management, there's drainage, environmental, and facilities. When you go to page 2 of 8, you'll see there's a number of facility costs, for example, and you'll see their total costs for the budget. When you move to page 3 of 8 on Appendix J, you'll come to the bottom of facilities, and you'll see at the very bottom of the facilities, you'll see the $430,900. And if we were to continue on to page 4 of 8, you'll see the $430,000 is in that allocation line, and we're allocating it back to where we keep all of our facility costs. And this is what I want to get council, I guess, used to, that we're going to start creating more of these allocations to give you a full cost of what it costs to run some of these departments and that. So that's all, we're just allocating those costs back. I think, and I've had some commentary with some councilors already with respect to these groupings. I think drainage is an area that council is, I suspect, is very interested in learning more about. Can we maybe be more self-sustaining? Can we bill out more some of these costs? And this is something that myself and the director of Public Works will spend some time in the new year to have some additional conversation with council on this area.
Okay.
So I think if we keep going on page 5 of 8, you'll see the fleet, the stores, and then the transportation. We call, and for the purpose of the budget, it's transportation and related operations. So I think council really knows it as operations. The acting director of Public Works and myself talked a lot about it, and they do a lot with respect to transportation. It's more transportation and then doing some other operational stuff. So we thought also for the community to understand that that's really the operations of the transportation budget. So then you get to page 6 of 8, and you'll see under the transportation budget, I'm referencing with a call out Appendix K, so that's the next appendix, and you'll see where I've broken out, just like we've broken out for facilities, we've broken out a number of the costs for the different actions that happen in transportation. So when you get to page 7 of 8, you see that reference again to Appendix K for additional transit details. And then you get to page 8 of 8, you see that fleet comes to 0, again, because we're allocating it back to where we put all the fleet costs, but this is where the costs that Public Works is recording to manage its budget. I guess this is kind of an odd one to take a break at, because really what I think to explain transportation, I really want to jump into Appendix K. And if maybe we'll jump into Appendix K and then ask for questions, because in Appendix K,
Sure.
you'll find the total list of what we spend on the different transportation activities within the city. We've broken it down to roads preventative maintenance, sidewalks, the spring and summer maintenance. We have some ditching and culvert repair activities, and you've seen the categories of expenses we're putting it into. Winter maintenance, which is always a difficult one to budget for, because one bad winter can create a real complexity for that budget. And then we have a number of costs that go around our railroads, that cross roads, and et cetera, that we have to do and maintain. I know that our Director of Public Works is available if there's also any specific questions on this particular appendix.
Okay, councilors, with regards to Appendix J and K, any questions? Those online, any questions? Hearing none. Harry, any questions?
No?
Okay. Councilor Bruno?
Thank you, Worship. Through you, and perhaps this is to Steve. Stephen, contract services under snow plowing, is there still a contract in Ward 4, or is that something different? I remember when Terry Simons used to do it, but I just didn't know what those contract services were for snow plowing.
Mr. Shapowski?
Yes, through you, your worship, to Councillor Paul. Those contract items that you do see are related to contract services that we have. We currently have a contractor on retainer. Actually, he performs additional work beyond when we're able to complete the work. So if we have 8 snowplow routes, if we have 3 people dispatched, and that's our maximum limit, we'll start calling the contractor out to help our forces ensure that they meet the minimum maintenance standards. So yes, you're correct. That is for that contract.
Okay, Councilor?
So there's a budgeted amount put in for that, Steve?
Mr. Shapowski?
Yeah, through you, your worship, to Councillor Bruno. Yes, it is, and they're actually paid separately for the sanding and salting, depending on what they're actually doing at the time or what we're actually requesting of them.
Councilor?
So just finally, do we often exceed what our crews can't do when they're called in?
Mr. Shapowski?
Through you, your worship, to Councillor Bruno. We do call them out often. We do have a minimum 100-hour call out for that contract as well. So it's a fine balance of making sure that we actually hit that 100 hours, because it's a guaranteed amount cost to the city. So we try to use them to our maximum extent to get that 100 hours every single year. But at that, we try to maintain the 100-hour balance, and we don't typically go too far beyond that period for a need there, unless we have significant weather events multiple times throughout the season.
Thank you, Mr. Shapowski.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilors? Any further questions? Okay. Appendix L,
Appendix L.
tab 13.
Tab 13, yes, for council here. So in this tab, we've tried to just identify at a high level the transfers to and from reserves, just to go over them quickly. The marina repayment, so the marina is being asked to repay money that they had borrowed, so there's $76,000. There's interest that is being put into the reserves as we go forward, which is $26,884 per our policy. The increase in working capital reserve, when we established that reserve policy, we also said over time we wanted to maintain a certain amount of money in our working capital reserve for flexibility. So that puts that in there. We talked and we saw it earlier about the municipal election for $30,000. There was one other community grant that was kind of unique. The community grants that were in the call out button, those are all things you're paying out in year, but you're putting money aside based on a motion that council made a while ago to support the 2021 Canada Games, although I called it 2022 in here because I believe it's been moved to 2022.
Yes.
So this is the last year of the commitment that you're putting funds aside to be able to put on an event with the 2022 Canada Games. There's also some additional, and you often see it where you're approving a report with respect to drainage where there's city portions in that, so this is putting some funds into a reserve to be able to pay those down. The COVID, it's not a negative number here, it's a positive. That actually, it's kind of reverse, but that means it's coming back out of the reserve to actually pay for some of those COVID expenses we talked about. And then there's the building department right now, as it's not fully hitting the self-sustaining model right now. We are pulling some money out of its building department reserve in this document. The parks, because of the self-sustaining entities, is putting something into the reserves at the 5,523. And then lastly, as was approved in the capital budgets, these are transferred from capital accounts. I think the capital reserve fund, 282,000 was budgeted for, I believe it was the wigwags, and we were going to include that in the ICIP grant to try to get that funded there, but for now it's out of the reserve. The self-sustaining entities, there is some money going back into them to pay for their capital requirements. And then as documented in the capital budget, we were budgeting, when we did sidewalks and roads, we were budgeting for both the capital requirement and the preventative and ongoing maintenance in that budget. So this actually, the capital budget put it into a capital reserve, and then this is pulling it out of that reserve into operating. I realize the confusion of it, and I apologize to council for that. That was me being new to try to figure out where they were being budgeted in the first place. We will move it out of the capital budget going forward and just leave it straight in the operating going forward. But it was a function of just how it was historically budgeted and, first out. So we'll fix that up so you don't have money going from capital and then back into operating. We'll get rid of that confusion in the future. So any questions on Appendix L?
Councillors, any questions? Those on the line, any questions? Oh, Harry's back. I don't see anything. Hello. Questions in here on this last tab? Seeing none. Very good. With Brian being fairly new to us, obviously, from our last treasurer who was here for a number of years, each person comes in, I think, no matter what position they take, and they like to put their stamp on it. And I think, Brian, in your case, you've done an excellent job with this budget process, not only today's operating, but the capital budget that was earlier. So congratulations to you, congratulations to our senior staff and all the staff that worked on this. I think they've done a heck of a job. So council, at this time, is there any further questions on this operating budget? Councillor Bodner.
Just what did we get to for a final? We were
2.44%. $81 for the average home value.
2.44.
Yeah. That was with the two additional staff members. Like my math was pretty good in my head there, Brian?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, council, online, I see the three councilors online. Any further questions at all? Okay, any further questions here? So, councilors, I'll just pick two. I'll pick Councillor Desmarais and Councillor Bodner. To move that the Corporate Services Department Financial Services Division Report 2020-168, subject 2021 levy budget be received, and that the 2021 levy budget as outlined in Corporate Services Department Financial Services Division report number 2020-168, subject 2020 levy budget with amendments be approved. So it is on the floor. Is there any questions or comments to that? Certainly. CAO?
So through your worship to council, I just want to make sure that we set the stage and that the expectation is understood across the board. Far be it for us to ask you to approve anything you're not ready to approve, but the capital budget was approved already. The operating budget is before you now, and with this motion would be approved. We've already talked a little bit about next steps, and that's bringing rates forward to council at a subsequent meeting, and the rate could be impacted by assessment growth, so that number you heard today could even be a little bit lower, and council would have a decision before them that day. But we do have a budget meeting scheduled for next week if necessary, and I would suggest if this motion is carried, that the clerk's department will do whatever it takes to set aside that meeting, which might save the clerk's department a lot of time in the month of November, because it's been a month full of meetings, and council as well. So I would like to commend the director as well as his staff, but all of the staff from the city who worked on the budget, and advise council that it looks like we would be able to dispense with that second meeting that's already scheduled.
Yep. And I'll leave that up to council. So it is moved and seconded, so it's on the floor. Comments, questions, council? I don't see any in the chamber. I don't see any online. All those in favor of the motion, please raise their hand. Those opposed? It's carried. Harry froze.
I think we might want to call that.
You want to call him or text him?
It would only be to record.
Well, it's just that everybody should know, because he might want to say, yes, I'm in favor, or no, I'm not in favor.
To recall that question.
He was giving you that.
So there's two options. We could hold a 5-minute recess and see if we can get him back in the meeting. This also, the same motion will go to council on the November 23rd meeting, so they will have that second chance for a vote, especially a recorded vote, if that's what you wish.
Well, that's fine, but I still like to, if we can,
Let's get them on.
if you want to just contact him let's just contact him and see, because I think he was voting, but it froze. So.
So provincial legislation regarding electronic meetings, he has to be in the electronic meeting by call or video. So my suggestion would just be to take maybe a 5-minute recess and we'll try to get him back in the meeting.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Can we call him? Yeah, like he was there when he wasn't on.
I thought he was
Yeah.
voting, and then I realized he was frozen.
Back on. So Harry, you froze on us there during the vote, so we just want to make sure everything is correct here.
Yeah, I'm back online, or back on the phone anyway. I don't know what's happening, but
So
I'm here.
I didn't know if you heard us. So you heard the original motion because you're right, correct? In receiving
correct.
and passing this budget, the operating budget as amended tonight. So that was
That's correct.
moved and seconded. So I'll recall the vote only because again you were frozen out. So I'm going to take the vote for in the chambers. All those in favor? That's carried in here. Online, those in favor, please raise your hand. Harry, your vote?
Here, in favor.
In favor, okay. And those against? Councillor Danch, we need a vote.
Just because I've been sitting here for the last 2 hours listening to this, we're going to have the opportunity to go through some of the expenditures and proposals from the different departments and stuff like that, because all I've heard is a bunch of numbers.
Well, that's what tonight's for, Councillor, to ask those questions.
We didn't get into any specifics, any different departments and stuff like that. We had a good presentation from Brian there and that, but there was no argument on anything. It was almost like everything was all good to go, and we'll just accept what you're going to tell us.
Okay. So, but I still, the vote has been called. If you're not voting, it's a no vote. So that's, I can take it as a no vote? No vote? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so that's carried. So just to point out to the public that'll get this tomorrow, will be on the YouTube tomorrow. They're not hearing us tonight. Oh, they are back on? Okay, great. So this will be set up by our staff tomorrow on YouTube, which is Friday, November the 6th. That being said, again, staff, thank you. Council, great work, great questions tonight. At this time, I'll adjourn this meeting.